Everybody could make it to our second implementation meeting. So thank you for being here this morning. Before we start, if there's anybody who would like to pray with me, I'm gonna pray for us. Father God, we love you, we praise you, we thank you for this day. Thank you for getting us here safe, Lord God. We just thank you for all the water professionals in this room, Lord God, the entities that they represent, Lord God. We just lift them up to you. We ask for your guidance during this meeting. We pray special prayers for those that need some encouragement this week, Lord God. And we thank you for your many blessings. For it is in your most precious name we pray. Amen. All right. So today we've got a nice agenda laid out for us. Got a good speaker, at least one guy's a good speaker, not me, coming. So we're looking forward to Michelle's talk.
Michelle's here.
Hey, Michelle, welcome. Thank you for coming and sharing with us your knowledge on land prioritization and conservation. So thank you for that. Before we get started, I wanted to just kind of give you a brief overview of the meeting objectives. For today, we're going to receive an update on the Water SC Water Resources Working Group and water planning in other river basins. So that will be interesting, as well as reviewing results of the synthetic drought simulations. We will review the results of Spartanburg Water Sedimentation Study. And then we will learn about land prioritizing for conservation and protection of water supply. And finally, we'll review the progress on implementation planning and identify actions to pursue. So with that, I am going to ask for an approval of the agenda as laid out. Does everybody have one? If not, we have some extras on the back table, I believe. So I'm asking for an approval.
So moved.
Got a motion. We have a second.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the agenda is approved. We also have had Tom provide us prior to the meeting the minutes and summary of our May 30th implementation meeting. So I will also entertain a motion for approval of those at this time.
So moved.
Have a motion and a second.
A second.
Second. All in favor? Any opposed? And those motions, minutes and summary are approved unanimously. I'm going to turn it over to John.
Right, thank you, Ken. Again, great to see everybody. Welcome. Public and agency comment. Any members of the public that are online or in the room like to make comment? Or any agency members? All right. And Tom, could you remind us who on the RBC is online today?
So far I've got Bill Stanger, John Alexander, and Amy Bresnahan.
Okay. All right, first agenda item. Since y'all last met in May, the governor issued an executive order forming the Water SC group. And actually, there's a picture of the group after their first meeting. In the executive order, there's a number of actions and initiatives that are directed towards Water SC. The most important one is Water SC is supposed to be overseeing the preparation of the state water plan between now and end of next year. So that's the big lift. In the interim, they've published a stakeholder engagement plan, which has been pushed to the project website. So if you go to DES's homepage, or if you just Google Water SC, SCDES, you can quickly find it. They post meetings. There's a meeting tomorrow in Columbia. There's a meeting on December 12th. I think those are the only two that they've posted, but they have a tentative schedule for upcoming meetings for the first 3 or 4 months of the year. They post a public engagement plan, and they include links to live stream and watch the meetings at the website. I think they'll be posting, just like we do, information and materials that result from each meeting. Another one of their actions and deliverables is to provide a report or some information to the Surface Water Study Committee that was formed by legislative action earlier this year or late last year, I can't remember. And that is due to the Surface Water Study Committee, which I don't think has been fully formed yet, right, Casey? And
to my knowledge,
yeah, right. by end of January. So these first several meetings that they're having, they're primarily talking about information to characterize the state of surface water resources and provide recommendations potentially on water law and water regulation, if there are any. So one of the things that they will be doing, and we're going to help them with this, is compile all the recommendations that have been coming out of the RBCs that are related to policy, legislation, and regulation, and summarize those and identify where there's common themes. We're going to be providing that to Water SC for their December 12th meeting. And that may kind of kickstart some of the discussion that's likely to occur in that meeting and after that meeting as they work on this deliverable or this report that they're going to provide to the Surface Water Study Committee by the end of January.
So does that include both RBCs in that are currently meeting, or just the two plans that are finished?
No, we're trying to compile all of the recommendations that are still currently being generated by
Right.
RBCs that
Yeah,
are meeting
that
right
would,
now, and
that
yours
would
and
be
the
fair.
ESTOs that have
Mhm.
already put it into their plan.
okay, yeah.
So, for example, at the Saluda meeting yesterday, we spent an hour or so diving into policy, legislative, regulatory recommendations. In fact, we've been using the Broad's recommendations and the EDISTO's recommendations, although they didn't get as much into policy legislation as y'all did, as kind of a guide to kickstart those discussions.
No, that's good. I was just wanting to make sure that it wasn't just the two that were finished.
Right. Santee, which hasn't had their first meeting yet, won't
Right.
have any feedback,
Right.
obviously, but
Obviously.
we've actually kind of changed the schedule, and even the Lower Savannah Salkehatchie, which is the one that's most recently started, they'll be talking about recommendations at their early December meeting prior to this Water SC meeting. So there'll be some good feedback, I think, that we can give the group. Joe Kuhn is online. Joe, do you want to add anything about Water SC?
Sure, just checking my mic here. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I'll just add that some further information has been added to the website at this point. No detailed locations yet, but they've put out the listening sessions and other meetings that'll be happening the remainder of this year and into next year. So that information, I encourage everybody to look on the website and attend and contribute as they can. So the goal is to get as much contribution and across our stakeholders, across the RBCs, and across the state. And there's various different ways you can plug in and contribute. And there's ways to provide comment on the website as well. And I think besides that, you covered most everything else, John. Thank you.
Yep. Hey there. Okay.
He'll probably be back.
Probably wants to come in the back door.
He works in engineering for us.
Okay, that's what I thought. I've seen him before, yeah. Any other questions about Water SC? Yeah, come on in.
Come on, in, come on.
Will you be presenting it all at Water SC?
So I'm gonna do a short presentation tomorrow,
Okay.
to just talk about what we've learned from the surface water modeling and all the
Okay.
basins. So a really high level overview of, okay, we've spent 2 or 3 years already doing
Mhm.
modeling. What has it told us? How much water is available? How much water is available 50 years in the future? Are there gaps? A very high level, but that's what I'm going to present tomorrow. Joe Kuhn and Rob Devlin are going to also talk just big picture items, how much water we're using, what are the trends in water use, what are some of the success stories that we've seen so far with water use, water management strategies, highlighting some that are already in place, and then what are some of the challenges.
Mhm.
And that discussion on challenges is probably going to lead into a Water SC discussion there later in the meeting of what they see as challenges and opportunities. So,
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Nope. All right, just a quick update on where all the other River Basin Council planning activities are. You all are done. The PD is getting ready to put their draft plan out in when, Scott and Tom, probably in December?
We should finalize it on the 3rd. and
They're voting on at the next meeting,
Okay,
assuming
You know, the draft sheet then.
so
the
maybe,
draft to be done.
maybe put out to the
Post
public
it,
sometime. in
Public
December.
meeting in January is scheduled.
Mhm. Okay. The Catawba is still working on their integrated water resource plan. Scott, I don't know when they're gonna wrap that up or if they're gonna be able to provide results to Water SC and DES early next year, late next year, do you know?
I don't know, I guess Jeff's not on call.
No, Jeff's not available.
I'm not
Should be
sure.
coming.
I can provide some updates late. We're working on the plan this year until about May is when our year 4 ends, which is when we should have the draft written.
Good. The Saluda just had a meeting yesterday. I think it was our 19th, 18th meeting, 19th meeting. Yeah, and we're close. We're maybe a half meeting away to wrapping up recommendations discussion. They spent probably a good part of the last 3 or 4 meetings talking about recommendations. It's a lively group.
I don't know if that's good on me or bad on me.
I don't think you've got any control over that, Jason.
No, they're all very engaged, which is great. So that's a good thing. We're getting a lot of feedback. We're gonna work on their implementation plan in the December meeting. So they're on track to have a draft plan ready early in the year, maybe February or so, and wrap up their final plan, spring. Upper Savannah is not very far behind them. They didn't, like the Saluda and you all, have to deal much with groundwater. They've been moving pretty quickly. Also a lot of good discussion there, but they're almost at the same stage. They have tackled most recommendations and they still have to tackle a few final policy and legislative and regulatory recommendations. They did like some of the recommendations you all developed on policy and legislation. Made a few tweaks to them, but they kind of liked them. So it was good to see consensus between RBCs. The Lower Savannah Salcahatchee is a little further behind. Statewide, DES recently made the decision to forego the groundwater modeling as part of this phase of analysis. So that enabled the PD to finish up their work. And we hadn't even started it yet in Lower Savannah Salcahatchee. So we're not going to try to do that as part of the plan. We've already done the surface water modeling for that group. They're going to talk about groundwater resources, but it's going to be based on kind of a look at demand projections and what some current trends are and leveraging all the information that's been collected as part of the capacity use areas and the groundwater management plans and the groundwater evaluations that are done every 5 years. Is that right, Scott?
What's that? Sorry.
The groundwater evaluations that you do once a groundwater management plan is out there, aren't they done every 5 years or 3 years or?
I think they review them every 5 years of the
Okay.
permits. Yeah, sorry.
That's going to be the information to help inform groundwater resource availability in the Lower Savannah, Salcahatchee, and the Santee. So we're not going to attempt it in Santee either. Santee Basin has been formed more or less. There's 13 current members, so a smaller group. We're still looking to add some members to it. But their challenge is to get everything done in an abbreviated time frame in line with when the state water plan needs to get done. In fact, before the state water plan needs to get finished. So it's going to be roughly 10 meetings or so at an increased pace. And we're hoping that we'll start that up for the holidays in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So that's quick status on where all the other RBCs are. Any questions? Okay, let's dive into the first technical topic. If y'all recall, we asked during the May meeting, would you like to see results similar to, or analysis and results similar to what we've done for the Saluda and in the Upper Savannah, where we look outside the historical hydrology and say, okay, what would it be like if we had a more severe drought or an extended drought? So we've created some synthetic droughts, run those through the model to see if that may further stress water resources. So it's kind of a what if analysis using the model, but looking at potentially more severe droughts. When we did this and I think I showed you all the results from the Saluda, we were focused on reservoir storage here, right? And in the Saluda, we didn't really see that even repeating the drought of 2008, 2 years in a row, was going to cause a problem for Lake Murray or Lake Greenwood. In the upper Savannah, when we do this, we did see that the Army Corps chain of lakes, Hartwell, Thurman, and Russell, after an extended drought of 3 or 4 years, you would start to have shortages. And that's kind of consistent with what the folks that use those water resources have suggested. They said, well, if that 2007, 2008 drought had extended a little longer, we might have started to see problems. And that's generally what the modeling demonstrated, is that there's a lot of storage there, but if you continue to stress it with severe drought like we saw in 07 and 08, you're not going to have enough water. So we wanted to see what's that going to mean to all the reservoirs in the Broad Basin. And we focused primarily on Spartanburg's reservoirs just for simplicity's sake. But we did this throughout. So we did 2 scenarios. The first one, similar to what we did with the Saluda and in the upper Savannah, where we repeated the drought of 2008. Not suggesting this is a likely scenario. I mean, to have that level of drought repeated year after year after year is, you might say, unrealistic, but never want to say never. The point of it was just to see if that was to happen, or conditions like that were to happen, when might you start to see issues, if you do see issues. Then the second one, I'd say, is probably more of a potentially realistic scenario, or more likelihood of happening. We looked at the lowest 30 percentile water years, so and then kind of randomly reorganized those. So kind of set up a dry condition, not as severe as 2008, the drought of record, but in the lowest 30 percentile. And then we ran those to see consecutively what would happen. We didn't do like a Monte Carlo type of analysis where we kept randomizing and kept running it. We just randomized it once and then ran it. Okay, and I should say, when we did that to each year, we kept the month-to-month sequence within each year. We didn't mix up the months or anything. So that's within a year. It's still based on reality, I guess, but mixing up the years was not historical. And that's kind of what it looks like when you look at it on a graph of headwater flows ranked by year. The green bar there is 2008, the drought of record basically in the basin, and then those lowest 30 percentile years are within that orange box. Okay, and we also ran these scenarios using the 2070 high demand projections. Okay, so this graph shows Spartanburg's 2 larger reservoirs, Bowen and Blaylock. The blue line is Lake Blaylock, the black line is Lake Bowen. The red dashed line is just showing Blaylock's dead pool. We're not showing municipal reservoir number 1 storage here. It's much smaller, but we're focusing on these 2 reservoirs. And this is the first scenario, the 2008 drought of record repeated. And what it shows is that after about 2 years in Blaylock, you've hit the dead pool in the summer, and then it kind of refills and then gets back down. So certainly a repeated drought of 2008 may cause some issues using those 2070 projected demands, those high demands. Same thing with Bowen. It has a much lower dead pool, but again, it hits that after a couple of years. So we certainly would see some stress if that 2008 drought were repeated. I'll stop there. Ken and other Spartanburg folks, does that make sense to you? I mean, is that kind of what you expect?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. This is, let me make sure I didn't mess this up here. This is comparing to baseline hydrology. Trying to remember now. Tim Cox prepared all these for me, and I went through them with him 2 days ago, and now I think I'm confusing myself. Yeah,
What
that's
is the
two-
yellow area? What is?
The yellow area is just highlighting areas where you know, start to see stress hit the dead pool.
So they're both
get to the
hitting
bottom.
dead pool
Yeah, they're
at
both
the
hitting
same-
bottom. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. This one was intended to compare it to baseline hydrology. So, you know, forget the extended synthetic droughts comparing to the baseline hydrology. What was he doing here? Now I'm trying to remember this. I apologize.
yeah, nice.
He's got Bowen, he's got Blaylock on here. Okay,
That's just,
this was not showing any synthetic drought.
yeah, that's just a baseline period
Yeah, it's
record.
just a baseline period that extends through that 2008 time. So actually he goes from 95 to 2000
So that's a-
using the high demand projections. And what it showed was that Bowen would actually, you know, hit the dead pool, but there's still water available in Blaylock. And that's what we saw when we did the modeling.
So, oh, okay.
Yeah.
This is just normal,
This was just normal using those projections
But with
50
the high
into the
demand.
future, right?
High demand
demand.
2070.
Yeah,
normal hydraulic. Okay,
right.
thank you.
Okay. So again, what we saw results for the 2008 scenario were that we would see reservoir depletions and shortages after just a couple of years. So there is the opportunity to mitigate that somewhat if you modify the reservoir operations. And remember, for Spartanburg's reservoirs and all the reservoirs we have in the model, we've got a static set of conditions for how the reservoirs are operated, when they release water. And that's important, especially for reservoirs that are in series, how much they hold, how much they're released to the next reservoir, where the intake is, or if they have multiple intakes. So there could see some adjustment and modifications to operations to mitigate those impacts. But generally, though, there's just not enough what we call wet water to supply all the demands under that extreme scenario. Looking basin-wide, and what I just mentioned is more important. If you modify those reservoir operations, you may be able to mitigate that. But there are certainly shortfalls with other reservoirs, suppliers that utilize reservoirs, which is Greer, SJWD, including York, even though they're switched from their reservoir. So forget that. But basin-wide, not just Spartanburg, we see a similar issue. Okay, the more realistic scenario, what would that impact look like? So this is a graph showing that 30th percentile randomized set. So we've run it through a time series. We're not just repeating one year. We're using all those lowest 30 percentile ones in a random order. And we don't see the depletions that we saw before for the 2008. We do see Bowen get close to the dead pool, you know, here about 10 years into this sequence. We do see Blaylock hit the dead pool here, but you still have some available water in Bowen.
Other way, right?
I'm sorry, other way around, yeah. But you don't run out of water.
Hey, John, can you describe that scenario again, which you did?
So it's taken the lowest flows from the 30th percentile range. So I think it's like the lowest 27 years
Okay.
of flow records on an annual basis, right? And then we take each one of those years and we randomly put them together. So I don't know what the random mix looked like, but 2008 is in there somewhere, and
Thank you.
yeah, all those years are in there somewhere, but we don't include any of the average years or the wet years. It's just all dry years. So kind of like, you know, a drought of the 50s, which had multiple dry years, not as severe as 2008, but there was a longer period of dry weather during that time. Okay, and at least the sequence that the model selected didn't result in any depletions. You get close, but oops, that was 2008. You get close, but you don't get to actually having a shortage. The two tables on the bottom here show, that's the baseline hydrology. So when we just ran, the 2070 high demands, if you recall, we did see that there would be shortages. That was before we went in and made adjustments to the reservoir operating rules, and we were able to remove those shortages if we tweaked reservoir operations. But this table right here shows with no adjustment to reservoir operations, just as a comparison to this extended drought sequence. So under just the base set of reservoir operations where there were some shortages using 2070 high demands, Greer had 7% frequency of shortage. Under this scenario of an extended drought, they'd have a 19%. SJWD was less than half, now they're about 1%. Just ignore York because that one's switching their source. And then this Gaffney would have been 1% up to 4%. Okay, that's really all I had on that extended drought. But big picture, it does show that there potentially could be stress if you have a more severe drought. I can't really speak to how realistic those scenarios are, but the second one, I wouldn't say it's out of the question, but just don't know. Thoughts, questions?
Doesn't that point to the idea that Spartanburg has a fairly resilient water supply for the next 50 years or so? Because I mean, even under high demand in 2070, during some pretty bad conditions,
Yeah.
they're still functional.
I think that's logical to say.
Okay.
And if you remember the 2070 demands we had for Spartanburg were, based on like the max month now, and then they were based on economic growth projections. They weren't necessarily put in as a realistic scenario, but we wanted to use it for planning purposes.
It's
right?
pretty aggressive.
So they're pretty aggressive, yeah. So,
And that doesn't mean they should ignore it. That just means that they've got the ability to continue to look. Yeah.
I know where you're going.
No, I mean, there's no panic that needs to occur because of this. This is that, there are a lot of water utilities that would like to have that kind of resilience.
right. Michelle, not to put you on the spot, but in the Catawba Basin, have they looked at kind of synthetic droughts or more severe conditions not based on past hydrology that?
We've chosen to do 4 climate scenarios, so kind of the bounding box of dry and hot, dry and warm, wet and hot, wet and warm. And we're running those through our watershed model to give inflows, and then they're doing the similar analysis for safe yields to look into the future on when those shortages.
Right, so kind of bigger picture climate change assessment.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right, if there's no other questions or any questions online, I'll move on to the next topic. Nope. Okay, the next topic is one of your implementation actions. In fact, oops. If you remember, this is from your implementation plan. There was a strategy C to research financial impacts of increased sedimentation on reservoirs and water resources, communicate those impacts to local government. So Spartanburg Water has taken on that for their reservoirs. It's something they've been interested in. So we presented some information to you all in May about the first part. The first phase of this project was to figure out what are the rates of sedimentation in their 3 main reservoirs. And then we hadn't presented yet on estimating the financial impacts. So that's a little bit what I want to talk about today. The results of that sedimentation analysis, those rates. We did some additional modeling, say if the reservoirs continue to accumulate sediment at the same rates, is that going to be a problem? And then kind of look at the financial impacts of sediment loading. The second phase, which hasn't started yet, but Spartanburg has been thinking about doing, is doing education and outreach to reach out to local governments to kind of talk about this issue and why it's important. And that's where that financial information is useful. And then figure out, where is the risk? What can we do to improve it? Where can we best spend our money? That actually kind of leads into then the presentation that Michelle is going to give to help with land prioritization. So if you recall, you're here during the May presentation, we talked about using bathymetric survey information that was originally collected by the USGS back in 2008 and has been collected by Spartanburg Water, and John Morgan is here. He's the lakes manager. They go out monthly on some of the lakes,
Monthly on Reservoir One.
monthly in Reservoir One, and then less
And
often on the other ones.
We
But
do quarterly on like Bowen and like Blaylock around the perimeter, and then do the entire lake annually.
right, so they've been collecting a lot of good bathymetric information for multiple purposes. We've used it to look at changes in storage. And we're focusing on Lake Bowen. There's about 15 years of information. Same thing with Res One. For Blaylock, there's less because the USGS did not look at Blaylock in 2008. So fewer years to look at rates of sedimentation. We're using what we can. So we showed some maps here that show 2008 and 2023 difference in bed elevations. I mean, you can just see from this that, there's a different color here compared to here. So that's one of the obvious areas where there's been some loss of storage. What's a little more informative is this combined map then that shows bed elevation change. For the most part, all of the warm colors, the orange, are where they've lost storage. There's been sediment accumulation. There are some areas that maybe have deepened or are related to scour, or they may be just data artifacts. We're not really sure. But that's what all these blue areas are. When you cut a cross section, here's one in the middle of the lake, here's one over closer to the end. You can kind of see the difference here. The difference in the bed elevation here is, almost 5 feet. Over here, it's 2 or 3 feet. So there's been some obvious change between 2008, 2020, 23. That was Bowen for Res One. Kind of see the same thing. A lot of the warm colors, the orange, which indicates loss of storage and sediment accumulation. Kind of see it in the cross sections here and over near the end of the lake. For Blaylock, because we had a much shorter period, only 4 years, don't really see as much difference. It's kind of a mixed bag. So not as conclusive there that there's a lot of sedimentation occurring, but it's hard to tell just over 4 years. From that information, we were able to update our stage storage curves for each reservoir. And that's one of the updates we've made with the model since we've used it for the broad planning process. So we've updated those stage storage curves to reflect more recent information. I should mention that the extended synthetic drought analysis that we did was using this new stage storage curve information. Okay, and I think I even showed this table back in May, which pretty much shows that Bowen and Res One have lost 6 to 7% of their total storage since 2008. Come up with some estimates for the rate of sedimentation, but 6 or 7% of storage in the last 14 years. So we've used that rate of sedimentation to say, well, what if that continues? What if that historical loss extends all the way to 2070? That would mean by 2070, Bowen would have lost 31% of its storage since 2008, and Res One would have lost 25% of the storage since 2008. So it gets a little more significant when you look 50 years in the future. So that raised the question of, okay, well, we didn't look at loss of storage and sedimentation in our original modeling. What if we assumed that actually happens? What's it going to look like with the 2070 high demand scenario? I should mention too, we made some other adjustments to the model with regard to intake location and what we were assuming. Ken has multiple intake locations in Bowen, right? I think we were assuming like an upper valve and we moved it to a middle valve or vice versa.
Right.
Yeah. So we made some adjustments there, but after making some model adjustments, we've got some projected loss of usable storage that we wanted to evaluate. So we updated the model with the new storage. We also, including looking at high demand scenarios, we looked at current average demands. We saw that using current demands over the 90-year period of record, we don't see any shortages, which is what to be expected, but we wanted to do the analysis anyway. Same thing with 2070. After updating the stage storage curves, we still don't see any supply shortages. It's kind of what we expected, but it's useful information. I should mention for Blaylock, though, we only had 4 years of information. If you assume a rate of sedimentation loss in Blaylock since it was built, then shortages would be expected. I think I might have a graph later on. There's some discussion of that, but this graph shows percent of usable storage available for all 3 reservoirs combined, and it compares the current storage conditions before we updated the model to the projected 2070 storage conditions under the high demand scenario, running through that drought area or that drought period from 2007 to 2009 when the system was most stressed. And before we updated the stage storage curves, the blue line, you get down to about 13% storage remaining. After we've updated those stage storage curves, accounting for the loss of storage, it's only about a 3% difference. You still have about 1 billion gallons of water remaining, even at the peak of the 2008 drought. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. Okay, just conclusions again. 2070 projected demands, high demand scenario, we confirmed no shortages using the historical hydrologic period of record. Mentioned this before for Blaylock. If you go back to 83 storage volumes and project that out, we can estimate that Blaylock, if that trend continues, might lose about 18% of its usable storage, for about 40 million gallons per year. And if that happens at the same rate, then there potentially would be some shortages in 2070 under those high demand conditions. So we didn't combine those sediment projections in loss of storage with that extended drought scenario. So that's kind of why I have that final bullet there. If you have droughts worse than what you've seen in the past, like we just simulated with the extended drought, you may have some issues, but we didn't combine those 2 what if scenarios into one. Question online?
Question from Amy. Curious if Spartanburg noticed sediment deposition from Hurricane Helene on the Broad River. There was significant sediment accumulation just below Mule Shoals in Parr Dams. The current state below Parr Dam is on Google Maps imagery.
John Morgan shaking his head. Yes.
Yes, we noticed some, especially on Lake Blaylock.
Yeah.
And Redwood.
Which 2? Blaylock
Lake
and
Blaylock.
just Blaylock?
Reservoir and
as
Lake
well.
Blaylock, yeah. Not sure if Amy heard that, but they said they did see some noticeable sediment accumulation.
Do you think that was new sediment or was that relocation of sediments?
Probably both the case there, yeah.
A lot of Blaylock, a lot of it's upstream, coming down like by the waterfowl area. There's a lot of new sediment accumulation there. Reservoir and Cuba Lake and some other locations.
So that brings up one consideration is that, if the trend of higher intensity, more frequent storms occurs, we're still getting maybe the same amount of rainfall, but they're occurring in larger events. Those generally tend to create sediment, like Amy just mentioned. They saw at Parr, and you've seen here. And even city of Asheville in North Carolina, their reservoirs have been out for a couple months because their watershed's fairly pristine. It's forested, but they just got so much sediment in that increased the turbidity, and it's been that way for a couple months. So a lot of sediment load, even in undisturbed watersheds, can result in issues just from scour, right?
Yeah. And we're seeing more loss of riparian buffers due to development. Maybe not so much under our control, but upstream, but then also the increase in non-pervious surfaces causing a lot more flashiness issues. You're seeing a lot more water enter the streams quicker and causing flashiness issues, which are perpetuating a lot of stream bank erosion and some other things.
Yeah. So point being that just a linear rate of sedimentation coming into the reservoir, sediment load might not be a realistic assumption. I don't know, but recent events might suggest that if we get these high intensity storms which generate a lot of sediment load, then that may be an inclining or increasing curve rather than a linear curve. Something to consider. Michelle, I'm going to point to the Catawba Basin again. They've looked at sedimentation. And I think actually we presented some of those results to the broad RBC a while ago, but have they done anything recently as part of this new updated plan to look at
No,
continued sedimentation?
we're gonna be looking at the sediment loads going into the reservoirs, but the Keops modeling that they're doing kind of holds a steady rate of sedimentation. So there'll be like a baseline and a future rate, but they're not particularly looking at the fill-in and the mass in the reservoir itself. We're talking about the loading so that we can extrapolate kind of qualitatively that there will be, more sediment in the reservoirs, so we're not mapping anything this round.
Right, okay. Okay. All right. Building then on that information we've developed from the bathymetric survey comparisons, the rate of sedimentation, we did some analysis to try to assign financial impacts. The biggest impacts are associated with loss of storage. And if Spartanburg Water wanted to dredge to regain that storage, or if they needed to identify additional supplies, additional supply sources, that's where the biggest cost impact is. And that table just kind of summarizes, dredging. They've already done some estimates on what dredging might cost. And we know what the cost of dredging Saluda Lake was 10 years ago, even when they didn't have to pay for the disposal of sediment. They've been thinking, well, if we have to dredge it again, which they kind of do because they're refilled, it'd be a lot more expensive because before I think the contractor that dredged it just took all that material away for free, which is nice, but so there could be a wide range of how much it costs to dredge, which generally though, it's pretty expensive. And that's what your study showed, is that trying to dredge just targeted areas of your reservoirs would be very expensive.
Right. And I'll just go ahead and say that, dredging is really not a cost-effective option at all for reservoir systems. I don't care if it's Spartanburg's or others, just in my opinion. If you don't address the root cause or some of the issues that have resulted in this sedimentation, you are throwing your ratepayers' money away. You may get some short-term relief, but you will not resolve the issue. And as Saluda Lake is saying, they're back in the same situation. So if you'll kind of go back to what our thoughts were on the Broad River Basin's actions going forward, it was really to obtain some data so that we could use that and paint a picture to some of the local or other governments to showcase that there are some issues with sedimentation. And a lot of these are perpetuated by some of the increased development, especially in critical water resource areas, proximity to streams and things that could easily come in there. So the thought is to be able to build the information, but not Spartanburg Water go it alone. I think this is an issue that I'm just speaking for water utilities in general, affects just about every water utility in the room. So it's more of having a combined effort to have this conversation with certain local or other governments, and even state governments to that matter, that we need to look at some policies or some ordinances or some changes and some things that would help protect some of these more critical water resources areas adjacent to these streams and reservoirs. At the end of the day, we serve the same public as our county governments serve. So, whether our ratepayers pay on the front end during a development process that may have better stormwater controls, or whether they pay for the treatment and everything that's going to be required to deal with the impact of sedimentation or the storage issues, we serve the same public. So we're trying to find the best cost-effective and environmentally friendly way to deal with the issues. And so that's the part of the study. I mean, go back to what we're really trying to accomplish. We knew this was going on, but we're seeing, it go on at a more rapid rate. So.
Have you talked to the local governments yet?
Not yet, but we wanted to get this information, but we also wanted to not go it alone. So we want to forward partnerships to have those conversations. This is not a Spartanburg Water issue. This is not a Spartanburg County issue. This is a statewide issue of everyone. We really need to have these conversations and be realistic that dredging is not an option. It would be cost effective or sustainable for our ratepayers.
Yeah, the best way to deal with sedimentation in a reservoir is to not let it happen in the first place.
Exactly. That's where we are.
And Amy second.
We would love to help, but I don't know if we're helpful. Good help.
All
Okay.
stakeholders will have a voice.
Keep your.
There's also financial impacts associated with loss of recreational value, loss of the local economy, property values. Michelle actually did a study that was work funded in the Catawba Basin. We used some of the sources and methods to try to estimate put a financial impact associated with this like they did in the Catawba. But here you can just see some of the ranges based on 5, 10, or 20% change in sediment loads. My first one had, I mentioned too, operational impacts. The more sediment load you have coming in, the more they have to do to treat the water. It could exacerbate other water quality problems. Contaminants can associate with sediments, just kind of compounding issues. So we do have kind of a baseline estimate of, impacts and kind of can tell the story better now. So again, that's what's going to be leading to the second phase of trying to prevent it from happening. I think that's all we have about this. Any other questions or comments?
The sedimentation is, I don't know, I'm not that familiar, but the smaller creeks coming in creating as much sedimentation as anything.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing in all the streams that come in. Obviously, we're getting a lot from the headwaters streams, but we do see impact to those cove areas with some of those tributary streams.
You talk about the real estate values, some of these people that have lots in those coves and the water's that deep now.
Yeah. John and Megan deal with that every day.
That's sedimentation problem, people.
Yeah, we got a people problem.
If we pull the thread on all these problems, we'll find people at the end of all of them.
There's no doubt.
Okay, before we get to Michelle's presentation, which kind of tailors off of this one and was also part of our implementation plan actions, let's take a quick break. Yep. 10:49, we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock, 10 minutes. Again, there's coffee out in that hall if you want some, and there's bathrooms both halls. Stair back up. Okay. So another one of your implementation actions under the improved technical understanding of water resource use objective was item B here to invite RTI and Michelle Eddy's here to talk about the work that they've done, not only in the Catawba Basin, but in other places that helps prioritize land conservation, both from a quantity standpoint. She's going to talk a little bit about quality as well. And we've got a whole hour allocated to this, so feel free to stop and ask her questions as she goes. Pull up her presentation. Yep, okay, so you can use the clicker to advance. And I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to show you a bit of work that we've done with a model we call Waterfall, the watershed flow and allocation model. And as you've heard from some of these things, we've been using it in the Catawba Basin for several years, and it's forming the basis of the IWRP plan there. So the first thing I want to do is talk to you about what this model is, kind of go over what it does, and then what data goes into it so you can start to understand the questions that we can ask with it. And then the different ways that we're looking at several different land management options and throughout the Catawba Basin for basin-wide planning, but then also project-specific analyses where we can say, okay, there's this parcel of land, what will happen if we can do something with it? So I've got a lot of information here. Feel free to stop me with questions as I go. And you'll see a lot of the work is from the Catawba Water Basin, but we also are doing work in Wake County, North Carolina, and then for the entire state of Louisiana, we're developing a nature-based solutions explorer tool for them based on this modeling. So you'll see sometimes it's not always North Carolina work. I've got a few Louisiana pictures in there too, but I think it helps explain all of the different ways that we're using this model and helping get on the ground action prioritized and quantified. So the model itself, the first thing I want to talk about, again, here's Louisiana, for scale. What we work at in, each state, you also have your river basin planning regions here. So the left side is kind of that larger region. And then in the hydrologic context, we have the HUP 8s and then the HUP 12s where everything's getting smaller and smaller. And that's kind of your standard hydrology that people talk about. And then at the lowest level is a catchment. And a catchment is the area of land around an individual stream reach, where any water that hits that land area is going to go to that portion of the stream. And that's the scale that we work at with this model. And there's a national data set called the NHD Plus National Hydrography Data Set that defines those stream reaches and those catchments around them. So we have a consistent data set for the whole country, and we use that as our basis of analysis for the model. And so in Louisiana, and I believe also in this region, those catchments are on the order of about 1 square mile. So when we look at things, we can look at about this square mile of land, what's going to happen here, and how's that going to affect that local waterway. So the model itself, waterfall, we've been working on this model for a decade now. We had an original version that we used for many years as a tool to do projects for our clients. And we've been redeveloping it over the last couple of years to build in all these features and this new aspects of modeling that we see could help answer more management type questions. So the model itself is a watershed model. And as I said, we break up the watershed into the individual catchment regions. That's that little gray figure above, where we have that each catchment is around a segment of the stream. We treat each of those catchments as their own little watershed. So we know what's happening within that area of land. The first thing we look at is the different types of land uses that are in that catchment. And then we also separate out the upland areas from what's happening right along the stream, the riparian area, which is that dotted line going along the stream segment. The watershed model, what it does, it says, okay, today you had an inch of rain. And we go and we say, okay, when that inch of rain hits the pasture area in this catchment, it's going to run off this much, bring this much nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment with it as it runs off. And this is how much is going to infiltrate on pasture land. And we step through each one of the different land use types. So we can break apart whether you have, a highly developed catchment where there's a lot of impervious area, not much is infiltrating, most of it's washing right off, versus a nice forest area where everything's infiltrating and you don't have much runoff. And so we do that in the upland area. We also account for wetlands and open water that are going to collect some of that runoff in those areas. And then anything that comes from that upland area, we filter into those riparian areas. And in the places where you have those nice natural riparian areas, they have a chance to infiltrate some more of that water and also remove some of those nutrients and sediments before that water hits the stream. But in areas where you have developed land, you're just letting everything flow right through. So with the buffers, we can also talk about the value of what's happening right along the stream channel. And then we also account for the wetlands and open water along those stream channels. So those are allowed to fill up. They have a certain volume that we assume, and when those fill up, they overflow and contribute more to the stream flow that's going on. So that's what's happening on the land surface. Anything that doesn't run off infiltrates into the ground. We have an unsaturated zone, which is immediate below the ground surface, and we know how much water about that zone can handle from soils data. And then as that fills up, it pushes the water down into the saturated zone. And from there, that water in the saturated zone can recharge the deeper groundwater where your wells are, or it can come out of the stream as base flow and bring nutrients and sediments with it that way as well. So in each of those catchments, those are the hydrologic processes and water quality transport processes that are happening. And then we also consider those human alterations along the system. So, whether you have a withdrawal or a discharge in each catchment, we can track that data as well. So we know at this point of the stream, you've got a loading of nitrogen and phosphorus coming from a wastewater treatment plant, or in this part of the stream, you have an irrigation withdrawal. And so all of that is taken into account as we calculate what's happening at each catchment and then accumulate those things down through the network. And we also have reservoir operations too, where we can figure out which catchments are feeding as inflow to the reservoir, what's feeding just runoff from a reservoir, and then what's coming out of a reservoir. So we have reservoirs included in modeling as well. So with all this differentiation and this data, we can then start to talk about management. And so we can look at management a bunch of different ways, and I'll show this through the data and the inputs, but just, pictorially, what happens if you change a portion of your land cover? What if you restore some land? What if you do it in the upland versus what if you do it in the riparian area? What benefits do you get from that? What if in your urban areas you add some sort of storage like rain gardens or infiltration trenches? And then what happens if you restore your stream channel or your riparian area? How is that going to improve your hydrology and your water quality ratings? So those are all the different types of things, and I'll dig into that as we step through the data. The other important thing, this is a watershed model, but it is calibrated. So we're not just throwing numbers and seeing what comes out. We are calibrating to observe stream flow and observe water quality concentrations where we can throughout the basins. So in Louisiana, you can see we had a number of different gauges. And we also have some gauges where we don't calibrate, but we validate, make sure what we have calibrated holds through other parts of basins. And you can see some of the reservoirs that we've included in Louisiana. In the Catawba Basin, we've used basically all the long-term gauges that we have, where we've got very few gauges down in the South Carolina part of that basin. So we calibrate where we can to the different conditions, trying to get gauges in natural areas, in urban areas, and agricultural areas, so that we're capturing all the different ranges of conditions that we might see. So what does this mean compared to what you all have been doing in the Broad River so far with the SWAM model? So the SWAM model, it has all these nodes and different points of where, you're getting information, where water is being calculated and you know what's coming in, and then you're allocated amongst these different options and operations. In the Broad River, if we were to model it with waterfall, it's kind of hard to see at this level, but all those little white lines are those catchments. So when we model the Broad River, we'd actually be modeling 4,000 little sections of river and 4,000 locations where we can dig in and figure out what's happening to the water quality and quantity due to the land change or the land uses that are there and the temperatures and precipitation each day. And so we'd be able to accumulate all that up, and we'd include the reservoirs that are in there and be able to say, this is more natural, here's what's happening here. Around the city, here's what's happening to your flows. Are you flashy? Are you nice and smooth? Do you have a lot of base flow? So all of that would come out of using this model where we're looking at the physical properties and how that is impacting the water. So any questions on the overall model? On what it does?
You might want to mention too, how it's used to support the ecological flow work that Nature Conservancy and USGS and Clemson did.
Yes. Yeah, so and yeah, I didn't even mention, we have modeled South Carolina previously with an earlier version of the model. And one of the great things about this model, because we break it up into all these different little pieces, when there's this existing data or biological sampling and people go out and count, count fish here and count fish there, or measure the macroinvertebrates over here. Normally trying to relate those measures, you're usually left with like the gauges, which is, a few sparse locations. With our model, because we have the time series and the data for every single stream segment, we can say at this stream segment where you took these measures, this is the stream flow that's happening there. And so when we did that with South Carolina, we've also done it in North Carolina, Louisiana, we've been able to establish ecological flow relationships where they take those biological measures and they say the condition here is good, the condition here is bad. We can say, well, here the flow is X and here the flow is Y. So here's the relationship. And so we've been able to set some standards that say things like you need to ensure that you have this minimum flow to support the low flow gill suckers. And you need to have high flows in the months of February through March. You need to have at least 10 high flow events that are going to go over bank to support largemouth bass. That's one of the relationships we just came up with in Louisiana. So we're able to relate to the ecological needs and put values and benefits around that. Because of course, then once we get into the management, if you change those, you can say, okay, my metrics changed. Did I affect the ecology and improve it or degrade it? So that is one of the other applications that we've done with the model.
And they're familiar with it. I just want to remind them that both models then were used for that analysis that Luke Bauer and Brandon People just did and was presented to the RBC.
Okay.
Yeah, Scott.
So when you simulate discharge at a particular point in the basin, you can. Part of the output is how much is surface runoff and how much is base flow.
Yes, correct.
Have you ever compared your base flow estimates to some of your more traditional hydrograph separation techniques to estimate base flow?
Not in a while, but we have done that originally to make sure that the methods we were using were kind of lining up with the gauge operations. So it's one of the validation points where we can look at that. Other things that we've done too, not exactly base flow, but the recharge estimates for groundwater, we've been comparing to other modeling methods like the soil water balance model that USGS does, and making sure that we're calculating about the same amount of recharge as this other spatially based model is saying for recharge. We've just done that with Wayne County.
You haven't done that comparison to soil water balance model in South Carolina,
No, we don't have that available.
because we have that.
You have that, then we can talk about doing that. All right. So I want to talk about some of the data that goes into this model. So you can start to relate to the questions that you can ask with it. So when I talk about the riparian buffers, the buffers, as I think you all know, and I think Ken, you mentioned before, there's different rules. Everybody's got different rules in different places. And so what we have done with the modeling, so we can take a larger baseline look, is that we're using this data set from the US Forest Service, where they have defined the riparian area using a 50-year storm return interval for the entire country on the data set that we use on the NHD Plus data set. So they have done this analysis where using gauge data, they know what the flow will be for those storm events. And then using elevation grids, a 10-meter grid, they can say, this area in the purple hatching will fill in during those types of storm events. So it is based on data from observations of stream flow and then also elevation. And it gives us a consistent method of defining buffers all over the place. What we have done with that is that in areas where there's wetlands or something, or another larger water body along the channel like this, we've made sure that we expand that riparian area to include all of those water areas, assuming that they are connected to the stream network. So that's the only modification that we've done. But this then gives us a way to look at the riparian area. So we don't know specifically that we have a 100-foot buffer or a 30-meter buffer here. We know kind of the area of the buffer, and we can go in the GIS and say, that is this width at this location, but we're not modeling a 100-foot buffer everywhere. So that's a bit of a difference from how you are going to implement them likely, but it does give us a starting point to look at what's happening in the buffer regions, the riparian area. The climate data that we use a gridded data product from Prism. And so this goes back to 1981 and then is stable up until about 6 months ago, so we can keep current. And it is, like I said, a gridded data product. So we're not looking at just rainfall that happened at one of these stations. This product extrapolates between all the stations, so we can tell when we have a high rainfall event right in the headwaters versus not getting much rain over here. So it also lets us know every day where the rain is actually hitting. And so it gives us a better simulation of the stream flow every single day in the river, dependent on where it is actually raining and how much those storms have dropped at specific locations throughout the basins. And yeah, this is one example of a storm event in the Upper Catawba where there's a good amount of rain hitting. This is kind of the Linville area. And then this is the headwaters of Catawba, which didn't get much rain. So, if we used a point right here, we'd miss those two extremes. So we use this gridded product to give our spatially distributed modeling a bit more information. So land use, and when talking about trying to prioritize management actions, we typically do different scenarios within the model. So we'll do a baseline scenario with current land use and current climate, and we'll calibrate that. And then we will look at a future scenario. So our current land use, what we typically look with is the National Land Cover Data Set. We've been using the 2019, they just released newer versions in the last few weeks. So as we start new models, we'll move into even newer data sets. And on top of that, we also often look at different classifications like the crop data layer. If we want to get different nutrient loadings factors, we'll know NLCD tells us that this is cultivated crops, but then the crop data layer will tell us this is corn or cotton or soybeans. And so that will allow us to more fine tune our model inputs. And then also the vegetation index will help us establish whether, we've got a forest in good quality or a forest that's kind of overgrown and degraded and dried out, which again, lets us put more information around our inputs. Another thing that we've used for both current and future is EPA's IPLUS, and that is that's a land use projection that uses a lot around housing density and uses. So that'll say whether it's a commercial area or an industrial area, and it'll say whether a forest is a timber area or a natural forest area. And so we put all that together, again, lets us get more fine-tuned with what's happening, what's happening on the land surface that will change our water. In the future projections, we've done several different options. IPLUS is done for, I think, out to 2100, so we can take different snapshots from IPLUS. Sleuth is another model that we used when we did our previous work in South Carolina, and there's a whole application available for the Southeast, and that model takes kind of transportation corridors and existing development and says kind of what's the likelihood that this is going to start spreading out. So it shows a lot of development along highway corridors and building out from cities. And then futures is a newer assessment that has modeled out, again, the development based on water use and existing development. And then they've put in some different factors of people avoiding flooding issues and a few other factors in there. So those are, excuse me, those are three different types of data sets that are available that we can start with for looking at the future and what we think will happen to the land surface. We've also done specialized futures. We have a new method at RTI called EcoShift, where they're taking looking more at the vegetative changes rather than just looking at all these development changes. And they're using drivers from economic on crop yields and who's growing what and what's the expected changes to crops so that we can get a better picture of, are we going to expand agriculture here or abandon it here? And so getting a better picture on the vegetative side. And then we've also done custom combinations like we're doing in Wake County, where we've used the futures data on top of the NLCD data on top of Wake County's plan for how they think the county should be built out, where they have these transportation focus areas and walkable community focus areas. So we can put a lot of different information, layer it on top, since these are all spatial data sets, and lets us take different looks at the future and how that's going to affect your water. So for the Catawba work, this is our future, actually this is NLCD and IPLUS for this is a current picture of what is happening here. And you can see, we can take a look at the natural areas, which are your greens and your blues, and then some of your lighter browns for shrubs and grasses. And then we can take a look at forests that are at risk. So by putting the NLCD and then the IPLUS on top of it, NLCD says it's forest, IPLUS says it's ex-urban housing. So we've got some houses spread out through there. So it's not just a nice pristine forest area. People have started to build into that. That changes what's happening to the forest. It's not infiltrating anymore. You got these sections that are padded down, you're going to get more loadings. So we've created these two kind of at-risk categories of forest lands, and that's really important, especially in where we're seeing these spreads into the more natural areas that are available. And then we have these kind of transitional areas, and they're a little hard to see. I did the current here, but you can see there's kind of some purplish, and you see those, that's also that spreading out, where you've got kind of these mixed land uses all coming together as we're starting to see all these developments come into what was natural or what was cropped land. So before I move on to kind of the other things that we put in this model, any questions on the land use side or how we look at this? Within each of these catchments, we know the area of each of these categories that show up in those catchments. So again, that gives us a picture for every stream reach. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about water quality and how we build that into the model. So just talk to you all about land use and all these different categories. When we have these land surface, different categories of land cover, what we do is we say from the nice pristine forest area, we are expecting about a concentration of 0.3 milligrams per liter of nitrogen in the runoff. And we expect the soils of a forest to have 100 milligram per kilograms of nitrogen attached to them. So for each land use category, we have these assumed rates of the nitrogen and phosphorus that are going to come off those lands as the water hits them. For sediment side, we use the mussel. So the universal soil loss equation that is used for a lot of sediment generation. We use the modified version where we can tell based on the day's rainfall and the peak of the rainfall, how much sediment is going to be generated off of these lands based on the types of soils and their cover factors. So each land use category gets a quantification of the loading that's going to come off of it or sink into the ground with the dissolved infiltration water. For the urban lands, we have a different type of rate since they're impervious and they're not, churned in with the soil. We're assuming that there's an exponential buildup. So each day that you don't have rain, we assume there's a bit more nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment building up on those lands. And then when rain comes, depending on how big the storm is, some of that washes off. And then it continues to build up again until the next rain event. So for urban areas, we have those rates. Those rates are all calibrated with our model. So when we do the water quality calibration, that's why it's really important to have the agricultural areas versus the natural areas versus the urban areas. It lets us tweak those values to make sure that they're representing what's actually happening. On agricultural lands, we also bring in those external inputs, and I shouldn't say just ag lands. Well, the ag lands for manure application and fertilizer application. So basing it on kind of the types of crops that we're seeing. And we talk to the region, we find out when do people typically apply fertilizer in this region. We set that period of time, and then we come up with kind of an average loading rate. So there's this external loading of nitrogen, phosphorus that will come onto the cultivated crop areas that we're simulating. And that gets churned in with the soils so that you have a chance that there's going to be higher loadings coming off of those lands. Then we have,
excuse me,
yes,
you do that on a percent space per catchment, or is a catchment all or nothing?
it is, if we catchments 1,000 acres, 100 acres of it of cultivated crop, then we have a rate of 26 pounds per acre per year. So we'll take that and we'll say there's 100 days of fertilizer, and we put that on the 100 acres of crop.
Okay.
So not the whole catchment, is for the cropped area. Okay. All right, so then we also have the point sources, which we go to EPA's very annoying systems. Sierra in the back of the room often has this job, and we're going to get this data out of EPA systems where they're using their discharge monitoring reports. So we get time varying examples or quantities of how much those different point sources are discharging to the specific locations of the stream. And then we have septic systems in the subsurface where we will try to figure out the number of septic systems, and we have assumed loading that each septic system is serving 2 people, 2.3 or 2.6 people, and that loading brings with it. And those loadings come into the subsurface loading that can come out with the base flow.
Can I ask how you get that information?
I see where you.
It's a little different every place we go. So for instance, in Wake County, thankfully we didn't have the job. We're working with Tetra Tech, and they got all the point locations and then had to go back and clean all that data up. In the Catawba, what we've done is we know the service areas for the water utilities, and then we put on top of that, which we'll have in another slide or two, population data sets. And so we'll say, this is a service area. We know 1,000 people are living here, And so we're gonna assume that there's, 1,000 people divided by how many people we assume on a septic system and put that many septic systems in that location. So it's a little bit of
Right.
differences
Right.
depending on where you are.
How frequently can you update the changes?
So it's our scenarios, so we can change data.
What I'm saying is, if you have a 1,000-acre catchment area and it's all forested and they go out and cut 200 acres of it, do you know that?
It's all dependent on the data that we get. So that's one of the things we've been doing in the Catawba is we had this 2019 NLCD. And since then, we were working with the land conservancies and are like, they just bought that land and turned it into a housing development. So we've gone back into that catchment and took the 100 acres of forest.
But y'all
and changed
don't keep
to
up with it
land use.
on a satellite type.
You can, but we're not constantly updating these models. We are getting a baseline and a future scenario, and then along the way, when somebody says, okay, we've got this new information, we'll come back and do another scenario.
Okay.
We can talk about the online tool that we're getting into that could let people do that on demand, but that's not kind of how we're typically working on these basin-wide projects. Okay, stream bank erosion, another huge factor for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. We have assumed rates that we again calibrate, and so I think I'll talk about the stream bank erosion on a specific slide. The point sources, I'll just go through this quickly. Like I said, we pull this data directly from EPA. It's time varying. In the Catawba, we worked with HDR. They had a lot of good data where they went to the individual water users to get their permitted values. When we don't have that, we use the EPA services on what they're reporting for withdrawals. And then for irrigation water use, we're using USGS's estimates that they have come out with on a Hub 12 level. So then we apportion that, and you can see like down here, south of Camden, we've got a lot of smaller irrigation users in that area. And the water quality data for the permitted discharges, like I said, we do a lot of quality control on this because it doesn't come out of the EPA system very clean, but that's where we get this data. And so again, point locations within a catchment. We've also been working on trying to not just the manure and fertilizer that we're assuming for crops, but looking where the animal operations are. And again, this is something Sierra's been digging into, and we know this is definitely an underestimate of where there's these animal operations because they're not always permitted, but it's a start for a way to say that we're expecting higher nutrient loadings in these locations because we know they got all their chickens and their poultry and they're just spreading some of that manure on their fields. So that's another input that we can have to help tease out where we're going to see higher loadings.
And where do you get that from? NRCS or the?
In North and South Carolina, we pulled the land application permits. So there's a few permits in there that say that it is land application and they had the type of animal.
Okay.
Sierra, any other thoughts on that? We've had trouble getting the CAFO data, like Environmental Working Group, was it? Like published a data set, but they won't share it with us.
Okay.
So
Yeah, because there's a lot of like.
Yeah.
Around, like, well, I don't want to show the exact location, but yeah.
No, I understand.
yeah, so this is also a thing, if we're working with a group and they've compiled this information or know the addresses of these, we could add them. But using the larger scale data, we're stuck with what we can get our hands on.
Right.
I will say also in Arkansas, what we did was we actually figured out that the land use data was showing up as developed in the middle of these fields. We had like two little cells of bright red, high developed. Those are the roofs of the poultry houses.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to actually go and count poultry houses in the middle of agriculture areas in Arkansas. So we get creative.
Yeah.
Go to insurance company and get the information.
No, we haven't tried that. Okay, the stream bank erosion. Again, catchment by catchment, we're trying to figure out where these channels are likely to be degraded and shoring off a lot more of their sides as the higher flows are coming through. So we've tried to use physical data and then we go back to the stakeholders and say, does this look right? Does this channel over here have a higher rate of erosion? Are you seeing that stream bank eroding there? to try to validate. So we do things like looking at the slope of the channel, how much impervious land is upstream of it, so that's gonna bring that flashy water straight through, whether they're highly erodible soils, the urban land in the riparian area, ag lands, the vegetation along that riparian area, if it's degraded. So we've put together the channel sinuosity, if it's a straight channel, you know, expect that to shear right off. So we put together a number of factors and try to classify the regions where we think there will be these higher stream bank erosions, and then those channels get a higher rate of erosion in our model. And we assume that kind of once the flows get high, we've been using the 75th percentile of long-term flows, that's when that bank erosion is going to activate and start bringing loading into the channel with the water flowing through it. So again, something we calibrate, but also is based on physical data, and then we try to validate.
Do you have a ranking system with each criteria, depending on like which one's more likely to be higher sediment load? Is that how you're kind of doing it, like?
Yeah, we've been playing around with these, trying to figure out which one we should rank, and does it need to have all of these things to be high? So that's where we've been trying to produce these. We've produced several versions of this map and been like, does this make sense? And you know, in this one, we focused mainly on the slope, and in this one, we focused on the urban areas. So this is still a place that we're evaluating the best methods, but it's really helpful when we have people on the ground that can go and look and say, yeah, you guys, you captured it with this version, let's move that forward in the model. But that helps us bring along those loads. So that's kind of all the things that we put into the model. Yes, any questions on those things, and how am I doing on time?
A half hour.
Okay. All right, so then what does the model actually tell us, and what are we looking at? So, and from Louisiana, but I have some pictures from Catawba as well. What this does is that, like I said, we get results for every single catchment. We produce long-term runs, we have daily data for 20 to 30 years is typically how we're run. In Catawba, we're going back to as for earliest as we can, we're doing 4-year runs in the Catawba to have the period of time for those reservoir operations. But then we distill that down into metrics. So for instance, this is looking at the median annual flow for every single catchment. You can see the stream network with the darker lines. That's where the flow is getting higher and higher. And so we can look and see, you know, this is an area here, up here in this highly ag land in the Washita, that dries out a lot. You know, they're pulling that water for irrigation. It's all channelized. You know, the flows dry out a lot, and then you have down here where things are wetter, receiving all those waters. Those have higher flows on average. And then with all those metrics and what's going on, what we can start to do is the what if scenarios. Okay, so we establish this baseline. We know how much flow is coming through every day. We know what nutrients are being loaded every day. Now we can start to say, if things change, what's going to happen? And so we can make our predictions for the future, and we have 2050. Now we change the land use, we calibrated the baseline. Now we put this whole new land use through, and we figure out what our change is going to be in each catchment for whatever we're looking at, whether it's a number of peak flows, average flow, minimum flow, nitrogen load through the model. And we can say, okay, so we're expecting this much change in this location. So then we can start to ask the management question. In this case, what we're doing is we said, what would happen if we conserve natural lands? So instead of letting these cities sprawl out, we only let the city areas develop more. We kept the natural lands natural and just filled in the cropland and let the urban areas get more dense. And we can say, okay, now we only have this much change. And then that gives us our benefit due to whatever management scenario we're looking at. And so we'd say we were expecting this much. If you do this, you only have this much change. You're preventing this much, or this is your benefit. And so that's what a lot of these management scenarios come down to. What's actually happening behind the model, of course, is that we're simulating those daily time series. And for each of those locations. And this is an example of one of the projects we did for a small community in Louisiana, where they had channeled off their stream with agriculture. And there's this nice wetlands area sitting over here. Their little village is flooded on this side of the river, yet the stream's channel, it can't spread out. It's showing that if you reconnected this wetland and let water go into this wetland, instead of having these huge peak flows, instead you'd still get a peak, but it'd be lower And then as those wetlands drain, you kind of have that extended period of flow. So instead of flashing, flooding, you slowly capture the water, let it drain, and then move on. So we look at things like number of peaks above the 90th percentile. We look at the durations of flows. We boil all of this data down into a series of metrics that let you figure out what changes make sense and what matters. So basin-wide, we can do this. So these are some of our earlier data from the Catawba Water Rebasin, and we can look at, in this case, this was just what was current and then what we were expecting into the future. We were looking at the number of high pulses. So these are our surrogates for flooding events. Where are we going to expect greater increases in flooding events? And you can see obviously around Charlotte, where you're developing more, but also up in those headwater regions where you've got Marion and such, and those areas are spreading out. We've got more high pulses. And then on base flows, where are we seeing greater decreases in base flows? Where are the streams going to dry out? That's important for your ecology or your water intakes. We can look at those areas spatially. And then that flashiness index. So comparative across the watershed, we can start to highlight important areas where we're seeing changes, where you want to might prioritize some sort of action. And that's what we did with our original Catawba analysis, and we're building to that again. In this case, what we did was we took all that data, we chose a few metrics. The metrics are down here in abbreviation. So we looked at for checking on where do we think the base flows are going to drop the most? Where are we worried about drying out our streams the most? We looked at the change in minimum flow, in flashiness, and then the 7Q10 variables. We took all that data, calculated those metrics for the current and the future, and then we're able to combine those and say, okay, here's areas, and start to target in those areas where we say, you know, you want to get more base flow, you want to stop some of that impervious cover, you want to get something in here where you're going to let more water infiltrate, keep your base flow stable. In this case, we were looking at sediment loading, so we were looking at the changes in kind of the overall flows, the mean annual volume, the 25th percentile, the 75th percentile, how are those changing? And then the sediment load, and we can also combine these in different things where we gave a greater weight to the change in sediment loads. We can start to see up here, you know, you have those nice natural areas, protected areas, but where the cities are spreading out on those highly erodible soils, you're going to have more sediment load coming in the future. So let's focus over there to do some sediment mitigation. And then similar idea with flooding, where we were looking at the high flow events, where we're going to see those. So this lets you get at prioritizing across the basin where you want to target management options. And this is just another example showing the daily data, but I'll move on for in the sake of time. So management options. Everybody kind of clear on how we're digging into the data? Okay. So these are things that we can look at. So you talked about satellite imagery. So this is one of the things we do. We look at the satellite and we see what's there. We see what our land cover says is there. And so that same picture there, we can start to say, okay, there's the town. Here's the areas that are kind of cleared for pasture. There's some crop. Here's those areas that are mixed. You got a few houses in there. And then what's that going to look like in the future? Well, there we go. We've got redder. We got more dense. And then all of those cropped areas, everybody's spreading out. There's those developments. There's somebody buying all those houses. And also the little bit of, you know, nice forest that was there. Now that's got that, you know, more at-risk forest. So even though you have some natural land, we're also expecting that land to kind of degrade in quality, and we can look at those changes. So that's the data at that course or that fine scale level of what's going into the model. And then that lets us start to say, okay, these kind of basin-wide scenarios, well, what if we were able to conserve the natural lands? Like I said before, we find areas where it would be of benefit to conserve, and we were looking at the locations where you have that nice land, but we're projecting it to change. And we can go back and say, if you held this constant, will you improve while everything else is changing around it? And so this is another example, kind of matching up to what is actually on the ground. You can see this field here is kind of showing up as cleared land. You have this nice forest area here with a couple levels of forest within it. Into the future, we're showing that going into that mixed use. And we're showing that forest degrade. But what happens if we kept that that forest area where it was now and didn't let that degrade? Will that mitigate some of the other changes that we're seeing in these other areas? So we've done that in the Catawba early on, and we're redoing that again now with our newer data. In our early Catawba analysis, one of the fine parts people asked was, well, what happens if you don't let those lands develop? Where are those people supposed to go? And so we're working now with this gridded population data. So this is what's helping us with the septic systems. And we're saying, okay, we expected this catchment to have this many people in it now. And then these counties are projecting to have this many people there. So we'll increase those people. And then we'll say, if we, don't let the this many people spread into those conserved lands now, then we have to increase the density of the urban lands. So we have the full trade-off there. We're not just saying, oh, we can't have these people anymore. And again, this was some of the work that Sierra did, figuring out how to make this happen, and how to figure out if we need to increase our density in those scenarios. So that's letting us get hopefully a more realistic picture of what would happen when you're conserving these lands. The riparian buffers, a big part of what we're doing in the Catawba is we're taking state of how are the buffers right now, what land area is within the buffer. And, in this area, we've got a mix. That pink again is that developed area. This area, look, that area actually has a nice little natural buffer right along it. And we can start to say, okay, this is our current condition. These are our conditions. Then what happens, this area here is zoomed in the future, if, again, there's that infringed forest, here's all that purple, gray, everybody's moving in along the stream. That's what we thought was going to happen in the future. What happens if we come back and we keep some of that natural land that was there natural and nicer? Can we improve the water quality, even though, we're getting people all around out here? And so we're going to do a basin-wide scenario, kind of look at the conditions, the projected future, and then the projections if you don't let anybody touch those buffers where they are nice now. We can also look at restoring buffers in different places, and we're doing that on a project level. And then the other type of management that we're looking at is agricultural conservation practices. And we got data from NRCS, and they told us in North Carolina and South Carolina, these are the types of projects that they've been funding the most or been funded for the largest amounts of area. So we were able to prioritize the different types of actions that we're seeing, which are these here, these 6 different types of actions. And then again, using our geophysical data, we're able to go in and say, okay, well, you're going to put cover crops on cultivated crop areas. So where do we have cultivated crop areas? That becomes an option for management. And then critical planting, we made assumptions on where you would do critical planting, took our spatial data, figured out where those are. And so we were able to prioritize the actions for managing different agricultural practices and make kind of the study map. And of course, this will never fully happen, but we model out the potential. So then once you have this information, you can go up to this catchment and said, if I fenced off that stream, so we took that riparian area, and we said, okay, no longer is it pasture right up to the stream. Instead, it's a semi-vegetated condition. How much nutrients do you reduce going into the stream? And so we can do those types of analyses and go catchment by catchment, looking at the benefits of putting in one of these types of practices. And then that gives some information that can be used in the funding. And these are all specifically tied to NRCS equipped practices. And there's that livestock example. So you have the pasture land. So we would come back and change this area within our riparian buffer from pasture to more of a vegetative cover. And that's the changes that are actually happening in the model to make that work. In Louisiana, we're specifically focusing on nature-based solutions, which encompasses a lot of the things that I just talked about there. But I just wanted to bring those up. So we're in Louisiana, we're creating this online tool that will let people examine these different options. We came at it from the perspective of what are people doing? What are people getting money for? People are getting money to restore land. They're getting money to preserve land. Along the coast, they're protecting those corridors where the wetlands are going to come as sea level rises. They're getting money from NRCS for ag. And then in the urban areas, they're putting in green infrastructure. So for all of these things, we do what we just said, where we have kind of geophysical conditions where we say this catchment has the opportunity to do this type of practice. And that gives them a first step of guidance of, okay, let me consider that. And then they're able to use the online model and say, if I were to take my backyard and put a rain garden in it, how much do I reduce the flow for that catchment? So we have all of these types of practices also available to change and input into the model. If you wanted to do more of a study on your urban areas, we can look at these different green infrastructure practices. And that's what we're doing in Wake County, actually. And then the last piece I just wanted to pull on, so I've talked about these like larger management scenarios across the whole watershed. One of the things we're working on with the Catawba group is they have their source water protection committee. And so the land conservancies come to this committee and say, we have this parcel of land or this group of parcels, will you give us money and help us buy this or put our easement on? And so we're working with the source water protection group. We actually had an original version, we're updating that now, where they came up with, we came up with quantitative measures where they can score a project. So Armstrong Creek here, we can put it in the context of what watershed it's in, what subwatershed it's in, what drainage it's in, and then what reservoir it feeds to. In the Catawba, of course, they have the 11 reservoirs in series, which kind of breaks up the whole watershed. But we can look and see the effects if this land, and in this case, this is one of the newer ones. Before we had been helping them prioritize lands for conservation as lands are developing. In this case, this is a small parcel of land right in the middle of all the Pisgah National Forest area. And so, you know, it's a private landowner, and what we're working with them now is to say, okay, how do we evaluate that? Because we're not expecting it to change, but it has value because it's proper, nice area amongst all this other area. And if you do let it change, you're going to degrade your water quality. So we've been working with them to figure out some scenarios that might happen if these landowners did sell the land. And they were able to say, you know, there's aggregate mining, they come in and they mine the aggregate. People are still coming in and trying to grow crops up there. It'd be another one of those housing developments. And so we can put all of those different things into the model and simulate what would happen. So in the runoff concentration, you know, your baseline was nice and low. You had, you know, a small concentration. If you were to do one of these scenarios, you know, you could really increase the concentrations of nutrients or sediments coming off in your runoff, and you can increase the runoff. And so we're able to say, you know, you will degrade your system if you don't keep this land as nice as it is. And that's helping them score these projects and decide that they should give money to protecting these areas. So we can go project by project. This is the scenario, how we mocked it up in the model of the full area, and then, you know, changing those land covers to see what would happen. And I think, yeah, and then the case studies. So like I said, we're working with the source water protection group on Armstrong Creek. We also have two other areas where the land conservancies are looking at projects in Torney Creek. They're restoring a section of headwater stream. And then this was a project, I'm not sure if it's still, there's land purchasing changes, but there was a sod farm. They were looking, what if they can restore the sod farm? And that's right along the South Fork, which of course has huge water quality issues into Lake Wiley. So what value does restoring that sod farm bring to the larger watershed context? And then Lake Wateree, they just finished one of the 9 element plans where they've developed a whole series of recommendations. And so we're going to run those through the model, see what benefits they get from that. So that's kind of all the things we're looking at and all the ways we're doing. And then this kind of summarizes everything I just talked about, all the things we can change and look at. Like John ran the drought analysis, we can run the drought analysis through our model, peak load events. And like I said, we do have the reservoirs in there. We are not a reservoir operations model, but we have basic reservoir operations in there that can give you kind of the magnitude of change picture, but we're not going to change. We're not going to be able to operate a daily reservoir release. That's not what our model does. But we have that in there. We have all of these different future considerations, and then these different mitigation scenarios. Yeah, and as John also pointed out, in our earlier work, we did take that all the way to the economic side of value of natural lands or value of reduced sediment inputs to a reservoir. So We're not doing that on this round for the IWRP and Catawba, but we have that original data and can move towards that. So we can also figure out what we call the bank rebuff. This parcel versus that parcel, we can give you the economic value of that. And then John said I should think about this, so here's what we would think about if you all wanted to do something like this here. So be looking at whether, thinking whether you want to do a whole basin-wide look, or you want to focus on a few things, whether you're only worried about water quantity or quality. What are these futures that we can simulate? Already having the 2070 high demands, that's something that we can include in the model on the water use side, but we can also create different climate or land use projections. And then just basically how level of detail you want in the model. Do you want us to figure out where all of those animal operations are that, we have 10 permits, but you all know there's 200 places where they're putting the manure on the land. We could put more effort into that or take effort away and just go with the permits that we have. And then the deliverable type with the IWRP, we're putting together this large document that discusses all the management scenarios and has fact sheets on the different case studies, and it's a report, and that's going to go there. In Louisiana, we're building an entire interface to the model where it is going to be available to the public, where people can go in and try out different specific projects on their specific locations. So we also have kind of the range of, how much do you want this to be interactive into the future? And how much is it, you just kind of want some management options prioritized that you then go and work with. And then obviously, as you all know, with all your meetings, how much do you want us to talk to you? How much do you want us to just rely on the data we can pull out of these systems versus how much ground truthing do we want to do? So those are all kind of the things that could be thought about if you wanted to take this forward in the Broad River Basin. And then we've got websites, we're still adding stuff, but there is a waterfall website that has some basic information. And then we've got some other websites for the work in Louisiana. If you're curious, you can go see what we're up to there.
So questions for Michelle, and before you're asking questions, I'll say that the other upstate River Basin councils kind of had the same questions about how is changing land use going to impact their water resources, whether it's sediment or water quality issues or what it might, flashiness of streams causing additional problems. They've all kind of had the same discussions that you had. What were you guys saying?
I was gonna say, is there some way that as part of this, that you can have values in there, dollar values? Because it all comes down to money.
Yes.
And I just, without having those kind of comparisons, you don't know whether this is better than that.
Yeah, and I should have put in the earlier Catawba work, but that's exactly what happened is we can tell you you're gonna mitigate 20 tons of sediment, but what does that mean? We can tell you that because you mitigate those 20 tons of sediment, you're gonna reduce drinking water costs for that treatment plant by $20,000. So yes, we have put economic costs on this before. Like John showed, we looked at lakeshore property values, so reducing the sediment, getting into the reservoir, recreation on the lakeshore property values. Just air quality and health from keeping natural lands natural. So the value of having an acre of forest versus letting that go away. So we have a number of kind of economic valuations that we can put on the information that comes out of this to give you the value of conservation or mitigation or restoration.
I don't know if this is, but going forward, since John, you're saying like these conversations are being had in all the basins, like maybe looking at doing this for the state as part of the state water plan, as opposed to breaking it up per basin. I don't know. Is that a conversation that could be had maybe at the water at sea level or moving forward? Because it seems if the data is available for the state, it would make more sense to approach it. At least that's my understanding. I don't know how they're based.
Yeah, I don't know how water C is going to treat issues like this or not. I guess my suggestion is that if each RBC thinks it's important, push that up to the RSC and say, hey, one of the things we'd like to do, we think one of the recommendations of the state water plan should say is, to incorporate this type of analysis as part of the next phase of study that really looks at changing land use. You know, we've looked at water availability and we've generally said across the state, we're in pretty good shape, you know, we don't see a lot of potential issues from a quantity standpoint.
Right.
But we know there's a lot of different uncertainties. But again, the big question, especially from the upstate RBCs and where some of the more high growth is down on the coast, Horry County, and that area, they're asking some of the same questions, but they're concerned about how is changing land use going to impact water availability. You know, we said one of the limitations of the SWAM model is that we don't account for changing land use. We're just using historical hydrology.
Mhm.
If that flow regime changes significantly, you get less base flow, you get higher peak flow events, you lose your ability to store water or kind of even basis, then maybe there wouldn't be enough water in the future.
Mhm.
So I think that's all something that the RPCs can decide if it's important or not, make a recommendation to Water SC. Maybe it
Yeah.
finds its way in the state water plan and maybe it's
funded through the
funded
state
through the standard, right? Or, I mean, you may decide, well, maybe it's important on a water utility basis. I mean, the Catawba Water E is funded primarily through the water utilities in the basin and Duke Energy, right? So maybe it's upstate water utilities getting together saying, this is an important issue for us. We're gonna fund it, or,
Right.
you know, we're gonna seek funding in support of ours. You know, there's a lot of different ways you could do it, but
Right.
probably end up having to be some type of collaborative
Right.
approach. And that's possibly too where some inner River Basin Council discussions would be useful. I think Casey, your
Right.
group made a recommendation that there be a inner River Basin Council formed for the upstate, or was it? I think it was your group, right? Or was it?
Well, especially for Broad and Saluda and the folks below us.
Who's below us?
Santee? maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Fantees.
Yeah,
I think that was Upper Savannah, John.
Upper Savannah
Yeah.
made that recommendation, yeah, okay. So.
Well,
Also called Greenville.
Yeah.
I'm teasing.
That's
No, they're in mine.
Yeah. Obviously, land use changes. It's happening. Aren't we the fastest growing state in the country or something? So I think there's value to looking at that.
And Upstate Forever's done similar work.
Similar, not to
yeah,
that
Not to
extent.
that extent, but they've done their own land prioritization
Mhm.
using different criteria and developed a kind of a critical conservation map, or what's the map called for?
It's critical watershed areas. So we did that in concert with Furman University, looking at, it's based primarily on soil erosivity and soil loss, but and nutrient inputs, but not, obviously not to that extent, but enough that it helps us prioritize.
And we had applied that in our watershed.
So we use it as part of our watershed-based planning. So we look at preservation, but also restoration, so septic repairs, agricultural improvement areas, but it helps us target areas that we see if we're developed would be most negatively impactful to water quality. So it helps us work with our land conservation team to, identify areas where we can go out and talk to landowners and look at putting easements on their properties. It's nothing to this extent, but it's, the first layer of information to help start having those conversations.
Conservation has got to have a value before anybody's going to appreciate it. So, I mean, all of these things that you are doing, if we can't quantify them into a dollar value.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
We'd reached out to RTI years ago, but we didn't have enough. But we're looking, we need the value. We need the dollar value to say.
But I
the
think you could put dollar values on your stuff, and you could tell the difference between what the value of this tract is and this piece of land and what they're doing.
Yes.
I think you could do that, and that would be the biggest thing that ever happened.
Yeah.
Is the environment to actually have a value.
Yeah, and we're working on that, and there's more studies coming out. Clemson did a study with the willingness to pay for like better water, so that's some newer data that we have. that I think was starting when we were working with Scott on the South Carolina project years ago. They were just getting rolled out, and I think that's been published now. So there's even more data that we could apply to this, because at that point, no one really had a benefit of the quantity of water. You know, if you're preserving this much flow in your stream, that no one knew what that meant in value. So I think there's more studies on that now, which is why when we originally did it, we were looking at the avoided sediment. We were able to get to values through that. The other thing that could be important here is corporate partners. We're working with some of them where they have these water stewardship goals and their water sustainability, and the UN report directives. Are they, doing things towards watershed stewardship and watershed? So we're working with some of those to take this data and figure out what they need to quantify to report out their metrics. So that's another area, where this can feed into some sort of value.
How do y'all calculate your evapotranspiration rates?
It's a temperature-based method. So based on the day's temperature, we have a potential ET. And then based on what's sitting in the unsaturated, the upper levels of soil and the land cover, we have coefficients for how much of that we think is going to evaporate.
John,
Sorry, Scott?
Which method is?
We're using Hammond still, so just purely temperature-based.
would Hope's weather system,
Meso network.
yes, would that play into this as well? If they're,
It might, so state climate offices have been looking to establish a mesoscale network like most other states have, where they have at least one high quality combo station in every county to be able to collect data. Casey's asking if that data would support model inputs.
Yeah, so we have a hydromet team that's been helping us dig into these gridded products that we use, because we have seen, sometimes we just can't get the model to recreate a storm event, and it's working everywhere else, but it's this one storm event. So the assumption then is that our input data on the rainstorm was off. And so we've been working with the hydromet team to try to do corrections on the grid. So that is one place where that could come in, and also help with kind of some storm templating, which is like repeated drought conditions. We can also recreate specific storm events and say, if this event got even greater in magnitude, or this event was shifted a little bit over, what will happen to the flows? So that's another thing that other parts of our group have been looking at. We haven't done that with our studies and our model, but it's something we could do and kind of look at specific events and tailor those and their impacts.
Daniel Hanks, who's not here today, was interested in all this. So Michelle and I and Daniel had a call on Tuesday. Michelle went through the same pretty much set of slides just to get his feedback. And he certainly liked the approach. He supported it. He thought there was value to it. So I just wanted to pass along his feedback since he's not able to be here today. Ken, do you have any comments or thoughts?
My comment is this is probably one of the better presentations we've had in the whole planning process. So we appreciate you, Michelle, and really it's eye-opening, some of the stuff that the technologies out there and the things that we can do to potentially apply some of this stuff. I think it is one of the missing things that maybe hasn't been addressed related to, the land cover and everything, and how we can actually use that not only for quantity potentially, but quality as well. So I would completely support this being something at whatever level. But from an RBC standpoint, I think this broad basin, we can talk or vote or recommend, but I think it is something that we need to do, push forward and say, look, this is a tool that could better serve the state of South Carolina. So.
And I did warn Michelle that they might be interested in knowing cost, small pilot scale or basin wide or the whole upstate. And I don't know if you're prepared to just offer an order of magnitude. What would a small, basin scale or sub-basin scale study look like?
Like a HUC 12 and then.
Or then maybe for the whole broad. Any ideas?
Yeah, so I'd probably start at like a HUC 8, not a HUC 12 even, because I mean that would be very detailed. But yeah, so all those factors that I talked about would change things. And so, doing like a Huck 8 with not the lowest, but at least some level of input where we've modified some of the base data and did, 1 or 2 scenarios around land use or climate. I'd say for a Huck 8, we're starting around 100,000 would be a very comfortable point where we have some meetings with you all and do some data manipulation. But as we get up in scale and add more of the detail, validating site specific things will go up. But for a Huck 8, I think 100,000 is a good starting point.
What did it cost to do the state of Louisiana?
The state of Louisiana, it's been a long time coming. We've spent a lot of money just trying to get contracts through with things. And we are building this online tool for them. So we are up to, at this point, I think a little over $1 million. But a lot of
So
that.
South Carolina could do it kind of in that framework.
Yes.
Who's the client and is it the state?
It's the Louisiana Watershed Initiative.
Okay.
So that office was formed after the floods in 2016. They got HUD money and decided to fund the state office that was going to take a watershed planning approach to the state.
Okay.
So they've had a lot of money to work with. And so we've been working with them. And TNC, I should say, we're working with the Nature Conservancy.
Oh, my question was about cost.
Okay.
I have other technical questions, but I can ask you offline there. So,
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Alexis, is lunch
yeah.
that way or
It's
this way?
actually, well, you can go either way. It's actually at the little break room at the end of the hall. So it's not out here. but
Okay.
a Couple rooms over.
All right, okay, get it, bring it back and
Please sign in.
yeah, if you're online, we'll probably start up again, I don't know, a little around 12:30, maybe just shortly thereafter, 12:35.
That way,
That way,
either,
okay.
either or, that way. Guy out of York. Well.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay. So
You know,
the-
and never about it.
30 minutes or so that we've got remaining for the facility discussion where you guys do most of the talking and I listen about what you want to continue to do with your implementation plan. We'll start by talking about some of the things that have been done since our last meeting. We did have a number of action items, which a lot of them were related to kind of starting some of these implementation actions. And I think I circulated a spreadsheet that we developed. I did circulate a spreadsheet, right? Of the
Yeah.
implementation
Yeah, you did.
plan, right? And on the right of that, we've added some columns to track what work has been done for each action. This will probably be the last implementation meeting that I'm involved in as part of our contract. It doesn't mean that y'all can't continue to meet. Just need to figure out when you want to meet again and how you want to meet, continue on. But at least I put that spreadsheet together so that y'all have it. You can continue to update it as you work on your actions. Some of the actions that we identified at the May meeting, some of we done, some of we haven't. Some of the ones that were assigned to me, I can't say that I've really done all of them yet, but I need to, and I will try to. One of our first is to try to identify what the baseline per capita use is, right? Our major utilities in the basin. So I think there's a suggestion that utilities report that in your sanitary surveys, per capita use. Sort of, no?
I mean, we use some of that for certain metrics, but not specifically reporting per capita.
Okay, well then maybe that first action item's gonna be a waste of time, because I was thinking that we heard last time, or there was discussion last time that would be a good source to find per capita baseline number.
Well, I mean, we use certain per capita to do like tap fee calculations that are specific to the service area. So, I mean, that's something that we and or DES would look at. Say you have X amount of residential taps. What's the latest census data show on per capita per household or something like that? And we use that to determine service population, which then translates into drinking water fees for DES. So that's the only real place that it's in there.
So it is, in that regard, it's captured on the sanitary survey?
It's captured, I mean, it's utilized as a
Okay.
formula to calculate population of primary and secondary populations.
So it's not directly then available on the sanitary sewer.
No.
surveys. Okay,
No.
we were thinking that would be a one-stop shop to get that, rather than having to reach out to all the utilities and say, what's your residential per capita? Or what's your per capita, but we were more interested in what's your residential per capita.
And we just pull the latest census data as always for our service area.
Okay, well. Do we, I mean, again, that was one of your action items to set a baseline. So you could understand if utilities started implementing water conservation BMPs, basically, some of the things that you suggested, or even if there's just a trend in per capita based on how housing is being developed now, more multifamily or whatever, you would be able to track that. Is that still something you want to do? Is try to get a baseline by utility of per capita residential demand and track it basin wide. Is it something that anybody's done before? I mean, do you guys do that as part of your master planning processes or?
I mean, you're looking at population densities for the most part.
Don't do it. You want to do it. Your action items you identified in your plan, but I consider your implementation plan as kind of an adaptive plan. If you decide that your originally identified action item isn't really useful or it's not something you want to work on or you want to scratch it, then now would be the time just to eliminate it. And I'm talking specifically about this one. Establish a baseline of residential per capita. Then you're going to do education and outreach to try to encourage utilities to implement all of the portfolio of water management strategies, primarily conservation measures, water loss control, that type of stuff. And then if they've been
It could be a nice data point simply because if it changes
You
over
can show the
time,
metrics, yeah.
the only way that we'll know if it's changed over time is if we have a stake in the ground somewhere.
that was the idea, right?
So I'd still put the question to DES to see if they don't have a folder full of that information
Yeah.
somewhere.
Exactly.
I can't remember exactly when they would have gotten it.
They did the same thing that we did. They used to, from what I remember, it was just the census data.
Yeah.
I think we do customer count and then like use 2.7 people per.
Yeah, and that's what we do, but we just
Yeah.
go back to the latest census data. We'll get our tax because it changes every time there's a census. So.
But to my knowledge, and when I was with DHEC, we never took the production numbers from the utility versus how many residents they had and tried to come up with a number. There's too much to kind of tease out of that for DHEC to do that, pulling out industrial customers, commercial customers.
No, if DHEC has it, it's because they asked us and we gave them a number.
Yeah.
That's the only, if they have that number from a bunch of utilities,
Yep.
then by all means, let's get it from them.
So if DHEC doesn't have it, how much success would there be, Ken, if you sent out an email to the water utilities in the basin and say, hey, as part of our Broad River Basin Plan implementation, we'd like to set a baseline for per capita residential water demand. Can you provide me what your 2023 estimated per capita residential water demand is? So, Bryant, if he sent you that email, would you have to do some work or could you come up with it pretty easily?
I do a little bit of work, but yeah, we could get it.
Yeah, what about Columbia?
It would be excruciating, but if Ken asks, we'll do it. I'm teasing, but yeah, we had to come up with that number. I think we have a climate action committee with the city of Columbia. They've got some goals that I don't even know about, but one of the things they wanted to know was what is our per capita water usage? Because if it was below a certain point, we got points And if it was above, we didn't. And, so I remember chasing that number within the last couple of years.
Was it per capita for specifically residential, or was it per capita based on your whole system of customers?
Somehow or another, we broke it out inside city, outside city. Okay, it was inside city number, and there isn't that much industry inside the city of Columbia. There's commercial and institutional. But I don't think I think we were able to pull out residential because in our rates, we have residential and non-residential. Okay, so we were able to look at residential usage. The trick was coming up with the right census number for the number of people. Okay. But, now that these painful memories are coming back, we were able to get the residential one.
Okay.
So it can't hurt to ask.
Okay.
And it'd be a good piece of information to have.
The action item then may be that I will check with DES and see what they have.
Well, I mean, they should, because they do the tap fees for every water utility, in the state. So they're asking us how many residential taps, how many non-residential taps they are, and they're applying a number to that to come up with our tap fees. So they clearly have it, unless they're using an old default number. But at one time we were, it was pulled, it comes from DES. So they're using some number to calculate population.
But
they are, I mean.
That's a number though that you update every year on your.
We do it
survey.
Well, no, it's when they send out the tap fees. They send out the tap fees once a year. And it's part of their budget process. And then we send them back our residential and non-residential tap numbers, and then they calculate a per capita, a population based on the tap numbers that we have. So it's basically per household if you want residential. They're using that coupled with whatever the latest census data is, hopefully for the county and not the state. But that would be a question. Are they using a state per capita, or are they using county specific or area specific per capita? I don't know the answer to that.
Are you trying to get the water use per capita? And that's the first part of it. So part of the problem is reported water use. I mean, we can probably come up with the number of people, different ways to do that, I think, but the actual volumes being used by residential versus commercial versus industrial users, that's where we don't have the information to get a residential per capita. So I'm not sure DS has any more. Unless we get withdrawal data separated out, I don't think
we would do it. Then that would fall back on the utility to tease out the non-residential.
Yeah, we would love for y'all to restart, especially probably, how much are you selling to industry? How much is commercial? That'd be great information. You just don't have a lot of that.
Because particularly in areas that have.
You're starting to see your pay.
Half of the overall water usage would be industrial, commercial.
Right. And that, if we included that would kind of.
It
would skew the numbers, so we wouldn't know if there's any effectiveness.
That's right.
Residentially based.
It just so happens the way Columbia has their rates set up, we can create a column of residential.
Yes, I figured most utilities could do that, I think, right? Because you know what your customers are, what category they fall in.
Yeah, it gets.
I don't know. Sometimes some utilities don't, but.
Yeah, like apartment complexes, a lot of times those are a commercial account. But some places they're residential account. It gets ugly kind of quick. I've worked at a few different utilities, and
pretty much all of them.
They getting close. At least in the upstate, and they're all different.
Okay.
Dominion Energy sends me a thing saying what my usage is, what the house similar to mine is, what the area use is. I mean, how do they know all that?
Their big brother.
Well, the power industry historically has been about 20 to 25 years ahead of the locally owned water and wastewater utilities on the usage of technology. Yeah, they've been doing things that we're just now doing. They've been doing it for decades. So that's how they do it.
Okay. So in 20 years, you'll be able to report a water outage on your phone.
Yeah, he said smart.
Smart meters, yeah. Okay, let's move on. So I will still check with DES, but I don't think they're gonna be able to give us the level of detail we're looking for. So it may fall back on just an individual outreach to see what we can get to set a baseline. Ken, you were supposed to, when you've been getting your knee rehabilitated, so you may not have had much opportunity to attend your kind of local water resources managers meetings. Talk about that.
I mean, I have mentioned that obviously because we actually did bake that into our revised drought management plans.
Oh, okay.
And so I think at least one other utility has, maybe more than one, has changed theirs and added that to certain levels of drought, say severe or extreme, where you go into a different rate structure when you hit certain things such as drought surcharges. So we've got, some have gone with 3 tiers of different inclining rates for certain drought conditions. And I think one has gone to at least 4 different ones. So yes, we've had that conversation. And I did work with the state climatology office when they were developing some best practice guidance for drought plans and ordinances. And so we did share with that thing, and they did publish it, the new rate structures that we're doing in drought. And I believe Inman Campobello did the same thing.
Yeah.
Those were a couple that were included in that draft, in that guidance document from the state. So yes, we've pushed that out.
Okay. We've talked about this in the Saluda and Upper Savannah RBC, but Greenville adopted a drought surcharge this past summer.
They called me.
Right.
And I gave them our stuff. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mentioned that. And the conversation we heard from Jeff Boss and Jeff Phillips was that, they want it to be impactful. It needs to be a deterrent. Can't just be, we increase it by 50%. I mean, I think it doubles and then it triples and then it quadruples as you get to those higher tiers.
That's what we did.
So there was definite disincentive to using high water during those extreme and severe drought conditions. Yeah.
So as a Greenville water customer, they did do this? Like
Yeah,
they
in the
already,
drought plan, yeah.
It's in there.
but not in their practice?
They're
Like,
practicing. If it kicks into a certain level of drought, it automatically goes to a different rate structure.
And I think there was a
And that's what
special
we did.
column for anybody that worked for Upstate Forever.
yeah.
And it's just,
You're singled out.
saying-
Multiplier.
But they didn't notify, I don't think they notified their customers. I don't know.
That was a secret.
Remember, I'm sure
And
it's
about
public
20
notice.
years before you report.
You just gotta show up, Eric. You gotta show up at these things.
No, I'm just gonna tell my husband. Stops watering his plants.
All right, the next one, there was an action for Frank to drive a meeting of the broad utilities at the SCEC conference. I don't know if
I'm
you got
glad you're
something on
going
the
over
agenda.
these. I had completely forgotten about that. I will. I'll shake the tree, see who falls out.
Okay. Next one was, and Scott, actually, I did this, so maybe I can claim I did one, but I took it from you, was check with Elliot Wickham, just recently left the state climate office to work for NOAA. But before he left a couple weeks ago, I asked him if there'd been any new drought management plans submitted by broad utilities, and he checked. Didn't see any other than the one you'd submitted, and Inman Campobello, I think, was the more recent one. So he said others may have updated them, especially since they've
got to send them in.
Yeah, they've got this new drought planning guidance document, and they've done some roadshow presentations to encourage people to update theirs, but not everybody always sends them in. Yeah, I don't think James or anybody from SCWRA is online, right? No. But we have talked to them about workshops, and I think Rural Water Association has helped with that. The last one, that's already been done. Frank did a presentation at the South Carolina Water Resources Conference in October, and Erica was there too in support. So part of that education and outreach about your plan. So took care of that one. Thank you.
Yeah, I was busy with number 6, is why I didn't do number 3 yet. That's right. That was it.
That's fine. Prioritize them. That's good. I even forgot about this. I'm supposed to gauge interest from RBCs regarding an annual meeting. So did the Saluda come up with a similar? I mean, I know they wanted to have collaboration with other RBCs. I don't think they adopted the same recommendation about having an annual meeting.
I don't recall it specifying annual meeting.
Yeah, there definitely has been interest in the other RBCs though collaborating.
Yep.
Not just operating in a vacuum. Especially amongst the upstate RBCs.
Yep.
I don't remember why I was supposed to be creating an online, oops, I'm skipping one. Scott Harder and Tim Leaner to communicate, notify the broader RBC if an existing gauge is retired, and I checked again with, I always forget her name, Whitney, thank you, Smith. Just yesterday, and she confirmed there's been no gauges in the broad that have had to retire or lost funding. And there was none that she was concerned about. A lot of the sponsorships are year to year, but they've always been renewed, and I don't think we're going to lose any gauges. That's your understanding too, Scott?
I don't think in the broad, I've known there's some other gauges. State that. Few others that they're using funding for.
Okay.
But. Yeah, they usually will notify me.
Yeah. Okay.
Like gauges being on.
We had an action for me to create an online catalog of gauges. I don't remember why I'm supposed to be doing that or what spurred that. Do you remember, Tom?
I don't have that notebook with me, but, I think it's just kind of like the library, we just want to have that kind of on a website to be able to look at the gauges.
Okay, well, I mean, if you go to the USGS Water Watch page, you can see all the gauges, both active and inactive. So I'm just going to claim credit for that.
Yeah, Bill provided that, we said easy enough.
Yes, there you go. Thanks. Yeah. We kind of covered this today. There was a future topic from Katie Hoddle, who's on the Upper Savannah RBC and has been working on the land prioritization for Upstate Forever and Erica. But Erica gave us a kind of a quick overview of what they've done.
Yeah. I mean, I can send out more information but it's not to the extent Michelle has done, but I'm happy to share a watershed-based plan with the group.
Yeah. We just did number 11. We did that extended synthetic drought analysis, so we've covered that one. The last two ones are about making sure we continue to have representation from different interest categories. And Scott, there was one for you to check with Tyler Brown and Soil District Conservation for Ag Rep. I don't know if that's still something that.
I've contacted Tyler, not just broadly, but other councils as well, and I haven't got any good recommendations yet, but I'll keep bugging him.
Okay. Anybody else on the council knows of a potential ag rep? Do you? We don't really. We got Daniel in the irrigation, forestry, and ag, and I think you're in that category too. Or are you at large?
At large.
You're at large.
John Alexander.
John Alexander, yeah, that's right. But we could use some ag representation. So, anybody knows of anyone?
Tell the Farm Bureau they're not going to be allowed to participate. And then they'll demand that somebody be put.
Okay.
I'm teasing.
Thompson Smith or
But it's true.
with the Farm Bureau.
Horse psychology.
He's on the Salute RBC, Thompson Smith. He's got great feedback. He's always attends every meeting. I wish we had him on this committee or somebody similar.
Yeah.
But he's the area, isn't he the area representative? But he could cross over into the broad.
We might ask him.
But does he know somebody in the room? We
I'm
ask.
sure he does.
We'll reach out to him and ask.
Yeah. I'd say y'all aren't still in Thompson.
No.
Yeah,
He brings
Somebody
a
has-
lot to the table.
somebody had a suggestion for me, which I did not do yet. Check with Josh Robinson, and I don't know who that was, and I don't remember how to get in contact with him.
I can help you with that.
You can help me with that? Okay. That was one idea for a ag
He
person.
presented at the conference.
Oh, that's right. Now I remember. That's why his name came up. Yeah, okay. Okay,
But he's done some stream restoration work with one of the farmers on the packet, that was the discussion point. And I think Angus, you might
Yeah,
put that up.
yeah.
And check it back out. So I had Josh Robinson.
okay. So this is the status column that I talked about. You know, want to track how we're doing against our implementation plan. So as things get done, we want to kind of keep track of it there. Simple spreadsheet to do that. Outside of that, Are there specific actions that you want to continue to advance? We've already talked about just the conservation measures one. Scroll down. Oh, let me mention some important ones. And Bryant, you can kind of update folks on what you've been doing. You know, one of the gaps that we identified was with regard to Cherokee Board of Public Works potential shortage. And you've been looking into an old intake on the Broad and then looking into potential interconnections. If you want to elaborate on what you've been doing.
Looking at, and we've already been in discussions with Spartanburg about tying in with them, you know, in case of a drought. But we do have an open mothballed intake, and we have looked at it, and we've got KCI engineering kind of looking at it, and then I guess planning out, budgeting when we can implement, you know, restoration of it.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at right now.
Good. Well, taking steps.
Yes. Hey, it opened our eyes. We didn't realize our Achilles heel was water.
Okay. Let's see. You know, we have a objective about improving drought management, and there's a number of strategies and actions focused on education and outreach, like develop materials on benefits and implementation of drought management recommendations, develop an outreach strategy. Similar ones on encouraging utilities to review and update their drought management plans, which there's been some progress in that. Anything else you want to do with drought?
I think getting plans updated, it's the big, that's the big push, and I'm talking to myself when I say that.
Do you want us to hold you accountable?
Please don't.
As I was reviewing the minutes, I saw something about tear sheets, and I don't remember if that was an action item or not. There's some discussion about tear sheets.
I think we talked about, you know, what are some key takeaways that, you know, as we're presenting information, say to a local government or state or other stakeholder that may be interested, to have our quick points, you know, ready to kind of a rip and run, basically a fact sheet, short page, maybe front and back, similar to what we did at the final meetings, where somebody could have a takeaway. So it's not, you know, the highlights are hit on one point. So if you're making a presentation to a local government or something, you know, what are the quick messages that you want to take across and take away that they can have something to reflect on after the presentation? Because if you give them too much, it's just going in the trash. So
I guess the question was, I don't know if you were developing that or if that was RDC. I don't.
well, we talked about just, you know, having something similar to what we did before. What are the key messages? And we don't have to recreate the wheel. I mean, we can hit some of the highlights.
It's almost like an abbreviated executive summary.
Pretty much, yes. That's kind of what we did before.
So we have that 2-page handout, but it kind of summarizes the whole plan. You might want something that just more focuses on what your biggest threats and concerns are.
Yep.
Where you want to see progress. So
Yeah, those could be tailored by the subject matter that you're trying to address the local body at. So
you also talked about, and I guess it was part of developing a communication plan, you know, kind of going on the road and reaching out to local governments that don't manage water resources, but impact water resources. Ken kind of talked about that earlier. Is that still something you want to do? Do you want to formalize that type of process or just let it happen where needed?
One thing that comes to mind when pursuing something like that is we've got this water SC going on right now. And in my mind, when the state stepped in with that, it kind of froze everything else until they get their thoughts done. I'm not looking for excuses to put something off, but until we kind of know where water SC is going to land on a bunch of stuff, I think I think we would benefit from having some of the ideas from that group in place before we start.
Yeah, but I think
roadshow.
well, I think there too, they need to understand the value of having those conversations to the local. I mean, we can have state things, but where we're going to make the most impact is going to be on some of these local ordinances and things that need to be changed. So I think if nothing more than an awareness level that we, that is an issue that really needs to be understood by state SC, the water SC.
Yeah, it's, is Bill Stangler still on?
Yes.
Yeah, so, Bill is on Water SC, so he's the lone representative from the broad RBC. There's Joe Miller and Scott Willett from the Upper Savannah. And there's 2 from the Edisto that are on there. Some of the RBCs don't have representation, but that's potentially an action item if you're wanting to make sure that Water SC knows what you've been doing, knows what your concerns are, knows what where you'd like to go, what's in your implementation plan, what you want to get support from to fund, whether it be something like Michelle just presented or something differently. You might want to modify an action and specify that, we need some way to engage with Water SC, and maybe that's through Bill. Maybe Bill would be kind of your spokesperson at least, but again, that's all up to you. Maybe, I'm just throwing out ideas.
Are the water utilities not represented on Water SC?
Yeah, there's a few.
There's Scott Willett from Anderson Joint Regional. There's one from Myrtle Beach,
Christy Everett.
I would think, what we're talking about, isn't it?
Well, that's how we view it. I'm teasing.
No, you're not.
No,
Real quick, I am happy to be a conduit to conversations with Water SC. I'm a conservation appointee, but happy to convey any information from the broad RBC here. And I know, and Erica was at this meeting we had earlier this week where we had DES listening to us, and we emphasized the importance of including input from the RBCs, which is included in their stakeholder outreach, plan, and including more input and trying to find a way to tap into local government. So the stuff y'all are talking about, we've already been saying, but we'll continue to say, and let me know if there's other stuff we need to elevate.
and to tack on to that, I think if Water SC had been in place when we were putting these together, that would be one of our action items, is to interact and inform that group.
Yeah.
Interact with.
Right. And I guess, you will have the opportunity as part of those in between Water SC meetings, stakeholder forums that they're organizing, which you just gave an example of one where
Right.
conservation folks were there.
Right, I think it's based on the user groups, so there's obviously one from the utilities, so I don't know who's leading that up, Bill probably knows, but.
Yeah.
But they'll have a DES person at those meetings, it's my understanding, and they'll kind of help guide the conversation.
So what was the meeting that you were in?
Ours was the Conservation Coalition. So just conservation organizations.
There was discussion around this at the Saluda RBC meeting yesterday, and Saluda RBC voted on a recommendation that Catherine Amadon, the vice chair, is going to put together a letter, which may be with input from Casey, and then get the RBC to approve it and submit it to Water SC, which just basically says, hey, we're here, don't forget about us. Casey, you can probably better say the gist of it.
Oh, that was the gist. I was gonna say, you could go ahead and get these interbasin together. We'll be happy to sign on as a co.
There you go.
Yeah.
It was one to give. So I made the comment, there are a lot of folks that I can tell on Water SC that have historically not been part of the water resources conversations that I've been involved in. They weren't necessarily on the PPAC. They haven't participated in a lot of things. So it's like, these folks need to know we're out here, because I hear that there is still a disconnect with different folks in water resources not being involved with their RBCs, or not even being overly familiar with what the RBCs are doing. To let them know what our makeup is, who sits on this RBC, and that, we've been following a game plan that was in place that we thought was a good game plan. And, we intend to finish our basin plan and come up with an implementation schedule. And, certainly what they do is going to impact whatever that looks like. And I don't know if we'll get into all of this, but I'm sharing with y'all. But how we're going to try to, support the decisions being made as long as our RBC supports the decisions being made. I think as an RBC, and there has been concern about the timing of the efforts that have occurred. One with the legislative group, and then two with the Water SC. We would have preferred to see that happen after the RBCs had all done their work. So there's been some angst about that, but we're trying to, certainly show support for the process, like you say, to certainly let them know we're a resource they could utilize. And we have good representation on our RBC with the various groups, and we're more than happy to participate. Now, we also, that's as an RBC, and like we discussed yesterday, we all have the opportunity to represent ourselves or our organizations as individuals as well. And it looks like there's a lot of opportunities for that. Even though I've looked at the implementation plan, there are already meetings that have occurred that I can't tell were, they were invited only meetings, although they were for the public. And so I'm curious at how that will continue. Because as an RBC, nobody's reached out to me, or as a chair for the RBC, nobody's reached out to me and said,
me either.
We're part of a Water SC. We'd love to have a sit down with the RBCs or the chairs or vice chairs and see where we stand.
That's right.
So,
I mean, it was funded by the state as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, the River Basin Council work has been the biggest, broadest, but has the broadest base of stakeholder involvement of anything that has ever happened. So.
Yep.
We need to take advantage of all that work. Jennifer Hughes with DHEC, and I don't know her new title, but it's way up there. DS, sorry.
Yeah.
She indicated that she'd be reaching out to the South Carolina AWWA Water Utility Council to try to get Guy and Jeff and those types. So that's one avenue for the water utility information to feed back in. But we can make sure to emphasize the River Basin Councils also need to be involved in the Water SC discussion.
Well, that could be a message that could be carried by the utility council.
Yeah,
if you
absolutely.
look at it,
Absolutely.
I think that should be
Well,
carried by whoever goes to the utility to reinforce that point.
I don't know how they focus on updating the South Carolina water plan by the end of 25 and River Basin Councils not be part of that same sentence.
I don't either. That's what
I don't know how they even think about one without the other being embedded in that. So, but I was a little surprised to see that water plan was going to be updated by the end of 25. So,
yep.
We're all learning this thing day by day.
If you look in the planning framework, in the back, there's an outline of the state water plan. If you look at the sections, many of those sections just reference work that has gone into the river basin plans. So in part, a good part of that state water plan has already been written or is being written in the next 6 months because it's pulling from the state water plans. There's 2 or 3 chapters that just focus on the recommendations that y'all have developed and kind of consolidating and finding common themes. There's a chapter on water management strategies, which all we need to do is consolidate chapter 6 of each one of the river basin plans and say, here's the different water management strategies that have been considered, adopted, promoted, whatever. So as outlined in the planning framework, I don't think the state water plan is going to be a huge lift for a good chunk of it.
Okay.
Okay, I apologize. We're already 10 minutes over 1 and we promised to wind up around 1. The last objective under your implementation plan was to improve technical understanding. And we heard from Michelle today about land use impact. So we've covered that one. Spartanburg Water has looked at financial impacts and continues, or will plan on continuing probably to use that information to try to make change. I'm just looking at the other technical recommendations we had here. There was one about continuing to consider ecological flow standards. The folks that did the ecological flow work, Luke and Brandon, put together a proposal that the Saluda RBC was considering to get more information available in the Blue Ridge province. That doesn't really impact the Broad that much, but they also put together a proposal to collect information that would support the same analysis that they did on wadable streams for larger rivers. That's out there. The Saluda RBC decided not to make a recommendation to support it. Not that they didn't think it was a bad idea, but there was a lot of talk on emphasizing using existing data to the extent possible in other discussions. But just I want to mention some of the discussions that occurred around ecological flow and whether that can continue to be expanded. Of course, we had one on, starting to move your focus to include water quality, including nutrient loading and sedimentation. We've already talked about sedimentation, and there is some effort being done to evaluate sources of sedimentation, and could continue to be done in that regard.
Hey, John, I've got a comment that came in.
Yeah.
A public comment, I guess. It was, we are on the North Paca at the NC state line, large acreage, floodplain areas, a tremendous amount of sedimentation came down the mountain during the heat. It's accumulated on the banks, in the river sandbars, and in the floodplains. Great presentation by Michelle. State needs to put a priority on our rivers. Where does the RTI and mitigation fit into all of this? Or it said IRT.
Maybe she needs RTI. If the RBC thinks that the approach that RTI discussed is useful and could be a useful planning tool, then we could seek funding for it. That's kind of where it fits in. There was a recommendation or an action from Bill Stengler about identifying pinch points potentially, specifically on the Enoree River. Just continue to think about that and decide if that's something you want to try to begin to work on. We had some strategies around not only doing extended drought scenarios, but looking at historical data, dendrochronology, to see if the long-term historical droughts, if they were to reoccur, would that be a problem with regard to water availability? And another one that I'm supposed to be doing, creating an online library, which Saluda RBC had a similar kind of data repository request, at least a link on the DES homepages under water planning for each basin where we could compile data that would be useful to the river basin planning process and that we've considered in the process or may just relate to the basin itself. So that's something that could get going. Another comment?
She clarified interagency review team.
What is interagency review team?
I know that that's a group that, I'm not sure what all they do, but they work on mitigation banking and stream restoration might be tied to that too, as part of.
Isn't Lorianne on it?
Lorianne is on the DNR side of things. Rusty Winterick is, I think, the guy who is that now DES. And then there's some other federal agencies on it. But it's more like wetland mitigation bank review and stream restoration and mitigation type stuff.
They're out of Charleston over mitigation.
Well. Yeah, but I think, well, maybe it's out of Charleston. I just understand federal agencies. Maybe the Corps of Engineers actually heads it up. The Charleston office with it. I'm not that familiar with it. So that's my understanding. That's as much understanding as I have.
Okay, well, that's a quick run through of what's still in your implementation plan. If you could pick one or two things that you want them to do between now and say if you met again next quarter, so 3 months from now, or 4 months from now, sometime in the early spring, what would you want to do? What would you want to work on? Thinking more baby steps. Is there something that you want to continue to push forward?
Well, I think the big thing that we've heard is we need to make sure that SC Water hears recommendations that the Basin Council has put forward.
Mhm.
I mean, again, we are a very broad group of stakeholders, and it was and that was kind of the beauty of the process is it was a wide variety of stakeholder groups that provided feedback. And that we should be able to push these recommendations to them or be used as a resource for any of those discussions.
Okay. I guess one way you could do that is, I think they allow comment at each meeting. You know, you could collectively or individually submit comment suggesting, hey, the RBCs would like to have a bigger role in this. We want to make sure that our recommendations are being considered. Think of a way that we can be engaged. Again, that's up to you if you want to.
Is there somebody in charge of SC Water? I mean, who is
Myra Reese is the chair, right? Scott?
I mean,
That's right. Yeah.
Could SC Water come present their plan and update to us?
Possibly. I mean, you mean as it's being developed or?
Well, yeah, I mean, what the objectives are and what they're doing and how they're doing it. I just, they know we had some input.
Yeah.
So I'll make a point of emphasis at tomorrow's meeting to encourage, again, the Water SC group, and really it's DES. DES is charged with leading this. So, when we got our update on what's happening with the state water plan today, that included an update on what's happening with Water SC. Some of the details weren't necessarily there because we're getting our second meeting tomorrow. We're still figuring out a lot of this as we move. But I mean, yeah, the basin councils are absolutely going to be part of it. They're specifically listed in that stakeholder engagement plan. So staff should be, and maybe this is kind of a breakdown where not everyone's been pulled into the loop yet, but should be interacting with the RBCs as these recommendations come up, both the January policy recommendations and the full plan that needs to be completed. But there's not like an effort to throw away the RBC work or do anything like that. It's going to have to go hand in hand. And I think as this group continues to meet, we'll get updates on what's happening with Water SC from DES. And I would like to see, and I will again emphasize this to the group tomorrow, that they make a concerted effort to both get feedback and information, not just from the plan that we published, but specifically from the RBC at upcoming meetings as well. And again, anyone can attend. Like John said, anyone can go to those meetings. You can watch them. Go to that website, click through the executive order and that engagement plan, and you can see what is going on. They're updating that pretty regularly. You can submit comments online. You can send them letters. We can draft a letter if we want that says how much more engagement we want, or if we want to summarize our recommendations and get that to them before they put that report together for January, we can do that too. But I think there will be a handful of opportunities. Some of it's going to come down to timing because, like we've mentioned before, it is a very aggressive timeline to get this whole thing pulled together.
Okay, so heard from Ken that I think the biggest priority would just be to engage with Water SC, make sure they know you're out here, you know what they're doing. Anything else that you want to consider moving forward before you meet again?
Well, if the window is 3 or 4 months, that's gonna put us almost to the South Carolina Environmental Conference. So the meeting at the South Carolina Environmental Conference, there'll have to be some noise made about that. So I can pursue that. The effort to stay involved with Water SC almost points me to this tear sheet again that we're talking about.
Agreed.
To get the basic bullet points nailed down. Because then we've got a
That's perfect.
consistent piece of information to pass out. And in my mind, those are the big three for the short term.
Okay. If you're able to convene a group of broad water utility managers at the SCEC conference, do you think they would have interest in learning maybe an abbreviated presentation like Michelle gave about land use change planning and how they could potentially implement that type of effort collectively for the whole basin?
I think so. I think that would be great. I don't know that we'd have the whole chunk of time that we had today, but
abbreviated version,
an
perhaps.
abbreviated version to show what kind of digital tools can be brought to bear.
Agreed.
On the land use planning, because everybody is wrestling with that right now because there's so much growth.
Okay. So Michelle, just keep that in mind. I don't know if you were planning on being at SCEC. It's in March, usually first week of March, or.
I'm good.
But there might be an opportunity, and we'll coordinate with Frank to do a really short kind of, hey, here's something that could be done, and the broad RBCs received information on this.
It's going to be March 10 through 12, maybe 9 through 12. 9 is a Sunday.
Okay.
There'll probably be some technical sessions on the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th.
All right. Anything else?
So did I understand you said this is your last this is your last meeting you're facilitating?
Well, I told DES I had budget left to do those additional modeling analysis that we did, and then facilitate a couple implementation meetings. So, yes, I guess.
Yeah, I'm just curious how we want to move forward with convening our group and facilitating that. We need you, but I don't know who.
Thought we rehired you.
Not for the broad. I did get a small contract to do some implementation meetings with the Edisto RBC, but we haven't done any yet. Kind of put those on hold. But if you want me or need me, I'm happy to do it. I just need to talk to DES about that. That said, I mean, there's nothing that special about me, and right now we don't have a lot to talk about in the next meeting. You guys are still welcome to meet.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need me, but I'm happy to participate. So, it's up to you how you decide to continue meeting and whether you want a facilitator or whether you can handle that. And I think more importantly is you need a reason to meet.
Right.
So you got to figure out why you want to meet again.
It's water's going to give us a reason to. Sounds good.
Yeah.
We will continue to meet as we.
Just in light of, Water SC's work, I think it would be important to show that, the effort of working on your implementation plan is important, and you intend to do that. If you don't continue to meet and work on that implementation plan, your plan your whole river basin plan.
And I think it would be good for them to understand that we've gone into the implementation plan, and as a result of that, we've identified some really, good things that need to be considered by SC Water.
Water SC.
Yeah, Water SC. Water SC. So,
yeah, I agree. All right, Ken, you want to close us out?
Yep. Well, John, thank you for facilitating the last few years for us. So I think we've had a really amazing group that we've put together. Appreciate all the speakers that we brought to the table. Thank you for all y'all's work as well. So there's been a lot of players, state agencies. Thank y'all for everything that you've done. We're going to continue to be engaged in the water resources of the state. So thank you for being here, and we'll certainly be in touch. So
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes.